Hey guys, tonight we step softly into a world where shadows wear polished shoes and power whispers instead of shouting. Picture it, Brooklyn, 1911. Rain slicks the cobblestone streets. A boy no taller than your dresser steps off a boat with his mother's hand in his and a slight limp in his left foot. His name is Gaetano Lucchese, but one day, years from now, he'll simply be known as Tommy. And that limp? It won't slow him down. It'll become part of his legend. You can almost feel the wet air clinging to his worn coat, the bustle of the Brooklyn Navy Yard in the distance, the creak of dock boards as families find their footing in a new world. Most kids like Tommy wouldn't last a week in what was then New York's wild immigrant cauldron, let alone rise through it. You probably wouldn't survive your first lunch break. But Tommy, he watches, he listens, and most of all, he stays quiet. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is by you. I'm always curious how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Tommy Lucchese doesn't speak much at first. His world is a cold one. Bitter winters in East Harlem, 3 families to a floor, soup that tastes more like tin than tomatoes. He watches his father, a bricklayer with cracked hands and no time for bedtime stories, slog back and forth from job to job. But Tommy learns early. There's no reward in complaining. There's only grit, or the gutter. That limp? It came from an accident in a machine shop. One wrong slip while cleaning a piece of equipment, and 2 toes vanished into steel teeth. Most boys would have been sent home to mend or to cry. Tommy? He showed up the next week with a new boot, one size too big, and a look on his face that said, "This won't be the thing that stops me." That look would follow him for decades. By 13, he's sweeping floors at a garment factory. Not just for money, but for proximity. The garment district is thick with steam, sweat, and secrets. Men disappear between bolts of fabric. Buttons aren't the only thing sewn in back rooms, and young Tommy notices everything. Who's carrying more cash than usual, which drivers don't make it home some nights, which trucks don't go where they say they're going. This isn't a kid who talks back. It's a kid who learns the value of keeping your mouth shut. But the real turning point comes one autumn afternoon on East 107th Street. There's a card game behind a delicatessen. Nothing fancy, just a back room, a kerosene lamp, and 4 men with tired eyes. One of them is a boy not much older than Tommy, a Sicilian with a sharp smile named Charlie Luciano. He's running errands for local gamblers, trying to rise without attracting bullets. Tommy watches from the doorway, pretending to mop, but Charlie sees him. "You play cards?" Charlie asks. Tommy shakes his head. "Good," Charlie says. "Keep it that way." From that moment, something settles. A thread stretches between them. Not a friendship yet, but a recognition. They're both boys pretending not to be boys. Both sons of Sicily, trying to outgrow their father's shadows. Historians still debate whether it was Charlie Luciano or Frankie Yale who first pulled Tommy into the life. Many people still think that Yale handed out favors like candy, grooming young boys into enforcers. But the truth likely lies somewhere foggy between friendship and recruitment. Regardless, by 15, Tommy's running errands no teenager should be running. He carries envelopes under his coat. He memorizes addresses and never writes them down. He learns to nod instead of answer. One hot July evening, he's asked to sit at a corner table of an Italian cafe. not to eat, but to be seen. A man named Salvatore Tequila is passing through. Tommy doesn't speak. He just sips espresso and listens. Later, someone asks, "Who's the kid?" "No one," comes the reply. "But he'll be someone." By now, the name Lucchese is starting to buzz among small-time players. Not because of violence. Tommy's not known for cracking heads, but because no one's quite sure what he knows. And that makes people nervous. The most dangerous guy in the room isn't the one holding the bat. It's the one sitting near the door saying nothing, and somehow still leaving with a bigger envelope than everyone else. He doesn't flash jewelry. He wears pressed shirts and shoes that look polished even on rainy days. His voice, calm. His eyes, never where you expect them. He's watching you, but also the guy 3 steps behind you. Do you remember the first time he walked away from a deal richer than the man who made it? That quiet confidence started here, in Brooklyn, among crates of oranges and whispered warnings. There's a night when Tommy walks home past a bakery that's still warm from late-night bread runs. He stands there, staring in the window, not because he's hungry, but because he knows the owner's books don't match what he claims. Tommy isn't here to shake anyone down. He's just filing the detail away. One day that baker might need help. One day, Tommy might forgive a debt that never existed. These are the building blocks of his empire. Not bullets, not firebombs, but small choices stacked like bricks. While others boast, Tommy builds. While others gamble, Tommy calculates. And the city? It's just beginning to notice the boy with the limp. The mornings in Brooklyn come slow and gray, as if the city itself is reluctant to stretch its limbs. Tommy Lucchese, now a few years older, walks those streets with a limp so subtle most folks forget it's there. That's the way he wants it. Forgettable. Not invisible, just unremarkable enough to not be followed. Because while other boys his age are chasing glory, Tommy is chasing patterns. The garment factory where he works is loud, hot, and bursting with ambition. Just not the kind you'd find on a resume. It's not just fabric that moves through those sweatshop floors. There are whispers sewn between seams, packages that go out without ever being invoiced, deliveries rerouted at the last second. And Tommy, broom in hand, becomes part of the furniture. He's seen, but never considered. That's when a person becomes truly dangerous. When people forget to guard themselves around him, he starts noticing which foremen are scared of which truck drivers, which names make even the oldest machinists glance at the floor. He isn't trying to be a spy. He's just observant. Tommy sees who's skimming, who's lending, and who's pretending. It's all data to him, gathered quietly like loose pins off the factory floor. One afternoon, a bundle of fabric falls, and Tommy goes to retrieve it. Beneath the cloth is a small, crumpled envelope tucked between bolts of imported wool. He doesn't open it, doesn't need to. He hands it to the floor supervisor, who studies Tommy's face for a beat too long before snatching it back. From that day forward, Tommy's broom is retired. He's given delivery responsibilities. His first route, a walk across 2 boroughs to deliver a single shoebox to a cobbler who doesn't sell shoes. Inside, no one tells him. But the nod he gets when he hands it over is more valuable than the contents. What Tommy's learning, slowly, methodically, is that silence is a currency, and he's already accumulating wealth. He's soon tasked with shadowing an older man named Vito the Brush Sereno, so named for his slicked-back hair and ability to paint scenes that no jury could ever quite believe. Vito runs minor rackets in the garment district, mostly involving union reps who enjoy cigars more than spreadsheets. Tommy doesn't talk. He watches, listens, absorbs. Vito, for all his dramatics, takes a liking to the quiet kid. "You're like a shadow that pays attention," he tells Tommy one evening over a dish of overcooked spaghetti. "Most people just follow. You already know where we're going." It's under Vito that Tommy learns the invisible ropes, how to spot a cop even when he's off duty, how to fold a bribe into a handshake, how to disappear in a crowd without leaving your seat. These aren't lessons you learn from a book. They're passed down in gestures, in raised eyebrows, in silence between bites. But Tommy doesn't just copy, he evolves. In time, he starts improving Vito's system. He shifts the pickup times by half an hour, changes delivery routes, suggests new drop points, less risk, less overlap. Vito doesn't mind. He likes not getting arrested. By the age of 19, Tommy has earned something that many men in the life spend decades chasing: trust, not respect. Respect can be faked. But trust? That's rare. That's when someone hands you a key and sleeps soundly, knowing you've got it. And so Tommy starts getting real work. His first big job involves rerouting a shipment of luxury textiles meant for a midtown designer. The kind of fabric that ends up on Fifth Avenue mannequins. The truck breaks down in Jersey. The contents get damaged. And suddenly, a certain tailor with underground connections has just the thing a new nightclub needs. At a discount, of course. Mainstream history doesn't record this job. But the tailors of the time, they remember. And some even whisper that it was Lucchese's move that first tied the garment district to the five families' deeper pockets. Many people still think that the Mafia only made money through rackets and blood. But those people forget. Every dress, every uniform, every roll of thread passed through someone's hands. And for decades in New York, those hands belonged to Lucchese's people. Tommy isn't flashy, he doesn't shout, but he starts drawing interest. One day, Charlie Luciano reappears. Older now, sharper, hungrier. He finds Tommy in a midtown cafe, sipping espresso like it's a performance. "You still play cards?" Charlie asks. Tommy smirks. "Only the games I can fold without losing." That's all Charlie needs to hear. What begins is not exactly a friendship, but an alliance. Charlie likes soldiers who don't need babysitting. Tommy isn't a bruiser. He's a mechanic, a systems guy. And Charlie sees the future. Not shootouts, but structures. Not wars, but networks. And Tommy, he's fluent in that language. Together, they orchestrate minor movements. Money shuffling from dry cleaners to dance halls to docks. Each loop tighter than the last. Tommy's specialty becomes stability. He doesn't run things hot. He keeps them cool, predictable. He also begins dressing the part. Slim ties, cufflinks, shined shoes that never scuff. You'd think he was going to a city council meeting, not a sit-down. And that's the point. Lucchese becomes known for being deceptively professional. A mobster you'd mistake for an accountant. Until the books close in your face. One night, Vito the Brush vanishes. Rumors fly, FBI snatch, internal punishment. Maybe he finally retired to Miami. But Tommy? He doesn't blink. He inherits most of Vito's operations and expands them with surgical calm. Do you remember when he first walked into the union offices wearing that gray overcoat and left 30 minutes later with 2 new trucking routes? No threats, no bribes, just a conversation and a handshake. Some men burn bridges. Tommy builds toll booths. The garment district transforms. It's no longer just a sweaty cluster of labor and seams. It's an empire. And Tommy's holding the thread. By the mid-1920s, Tommy Lucchese no longer walks through the garment district unnoticed. He's not loud, he's not theatrical, and he certainly doesn't make headlines. But he leaves impressions, just not the kind that show up in newspapers. Among tailors and truckers, his name becomes shorthand for, "You'd better not screw this up." And in the hazy back rooms of New York's underground, his presence at a table means the real meeting has just begun. He's no longer the quiet kid carrying shoeboxes. Now he's the one deciding who carries what. That's when the real gravity of Charles Lucky Luciano pulls Tommy into orbit. Luciano is climbing, fast. He's sidestepping the old Sicilian traditions that keep men in fear and instead building something modern, a syndicate with rules, a business-minded underworld. And Tommy? He fits the mold perfectly, not because he craves power, but because he understands infrastructure. Luciano brings him in slowly, strategically. First, a few shared routes. Then, silent involvement in labor talks. Finally, deeper moves, like where union dues disappear to, and who owns the trucks transporting strike-breaking materials. The Castellammarese War begins to brew, a bloody chess match for control of New York's underworld, led by Joe the Boss Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano. Violence crackles through the air like a summer storm that never breaks. Tommy doesn't run to the front lines. He knows better. He stays behind the curtain, managing logistics, making sure weapons and whispers arrive at the right time and place. Many people still think that Lucchese played a minor role during this war. After all, he wasn't the one ordering hits or rallying crews. But others argue, and this is where the scholarly debates still flicker, that Tommy was quietly ensuring Luciano's eventual victory by controlling the arteries, money, goods, and muscle deployment. It's not glamorous work, but it's decisive. Do you remember that warehouse fire on Roosevelt Street in 1930? Most called it an accident. But those in the know whispered that Lucchese ensured certain ledgers disappeared that night. Ledgers that would have tied Maranzano's crew to out-of-town bribes. Without proof, the accusations vanished, just like the paper trail. When Masseria is ultimately assassinated in 1931, a new day dawns for organized crime in America. The 5 families are formed, and the Commission, a governing body to keep the peace among mob families, is established. Tommy isn't at the center of this arrangement, but he's in the room. Not speaking much, just nodding, observing, committing the entire structure to memory like blueprints for a building no one else realizes he's already reinforcing. Soon after, Luciano rewards him, not with gold or ceremonies, but with something far more valuable, his own seat at the table. Tommy is handed control of what was once Gaetano Reyna's operation, a collection of rackets that stretch from the Bronx to parts of Manhattan. Quietly, subtly, it becomes the Lucchese family. But Tommy doesn't rush to stamp his name on it. That's not his way. For him, power doesn't need a banner. It just needs to function without falling apart. He begins reshaping the family, not through violence, but through efficiency. Bookkeeping, negotiations, whispered understandings. He doesn't need to threaten anyone. He just makes it more profitable to agree with him. A prime example, the labor unions. Most mobsters see unions as cash cows to be milked aggressively. Tommy? He sees them as ecosystems. He doesn't just take, he invests. He helps certain leaders rise, protects pension plans, just enough to keep workers content, and ensures shipping routes run like clockwork. In return, he gets loyalty, stability, predictability, and a cut of everything. He also introduces something few mobsters ever bother with: mediation. When two rival contractors argue over a delivery route, Tommy steps in, not with fists, but with numbers. He shows who's losing more by fighting than by cooperating. The result? Fewer bodies, more revenue. It's the kind of thinking you'd expect from a corporate strategist, not a mob don. But Tommy isn't most dons. One such story unfolds during a rainy week in 1933. Two rival fabric haulers, both connected to Lucchese's operation, begin sabotaging each other's trucks. Deliveries are late, clients complain. Union reps are an inch from walking out. Most bosses would settle this with a hit. Tommy invites both drivers to a pastry shop in the Bronx. He doesn't raise his voice, just orders them each a cannoli. Then he quietly lays out how much money they've lost this week, how many contracts are at risk, and how easily he can replace both of them with someone smarter. They stop fighting. They even end up sharing a route. Tommy's idea, of course. This is where Lucchese starts becoming more than just respected. He becomes relied upon, and as his power grows, so does his circle. One name in particular stands out: Carmine DeSapio. A rising figure in Tammany Hall, DeSapio holds sway over New York's political machinery. And Tommy? He sees a new frontier. While others chase rackets, he nurtures influence. He helps candidates quietly, secures contracts discreetly, and soon he's got judges and city planners who return his calls. Carefully, of course, and only after hours. It's not about blackmail. It's about leverage. Even Lucky Luciano, who's no slouch in strategy, begins to defer to Tommy in labor matters. Ask Lucchese, he's known to say, when discussions drift toward dock strikes or trucking problems. And Tommy, as always, answers with precision, not passion. That same year, he begins hosting small dinners in his modest home. No mansions, no bodyguards at the door, just a table, some wine, a few key men, and a lot of quiet decision-making. He listens more than he speaks. But when he does speak, people lean in. There's a calm to him, an unsettling calm, like a lake that never ripples, but somehow drowns boats. The FBI begins noticing him too, though with some frustration. They follow, they photograph, they record conversations, but he never says anything useful. One agent even notes in a report, Lucchese is either the dullest gangster alive or the smartest. Some believe he's both. And always, Tommy stays out of the papers. While other mobsters end up in front-page stories for wild shootouts or courtroom dramas, Lucchese stays in the shadows, his name only surfacing in the occasional labor probe or obscure footnote. That's how he likes it, because in his world, visibility is a liability. Fame is a curse. And Tommy Lucchese? He's building something far more lasting than headlines. He's building a dynasty. The back rooms of New York in the mid-1930s hum with a rhythm all their own, a pulse of low voices, the scrape of matchboxes, the steady shuffle of folded envelopes passed under coat sleeves. And right in the middle of it, somehow invisible to the untrained eye, sits Tommy Lucchese, not in a spotlight, not behind a podium, just sitting, watching, managing. His headquarters isn't some velvet-lined mob palace. It's a second-floor room above a florist's shop in East Harlem. A creaky wooden chair, a small desk, a worn carpet that's seen more secrets than confessionals. And yet, from this room, orders are given that ripple through the garment industry, the docks, and even the halls of city government. One of the regular visitors is a man named Louis Shirts, DeMarco, a loudmouth with a taste for Cuban cigars and backroom poker. Louis's got muscle, but no subtlety. Tommy tolerates him. mostly because Louis's crew controls two major delivery routes that Lucchese quietly acquired through a handshake and a favor no one saw coming. One afternoon, Louis bursts into the office ranting about a missed shipment and a double cross. He's red in the face, voice too loud, necktie crooked like it's trying to leave the party early. Tommy doesn't stand. He doesn't even look up from the folder he's reading. "You finished?" he asks gently. Louis stops mid-sentence. "Good," Tommy says. "Then go fix it. And next time leave your tantrum in the car." That's Lucchese in a nutshell. Never louder than necessary, but sharp enough to leave paper cuts on egos. He's also begun developing what would later become a signature strength, identifying weakness in systems, not just in people, but in entire operations. A route too exposed, a warehouse too reliant on one man, a numbers racket with inconsistent collection times. He doesn't just correct mistakes, he redesigns the structure. One such correction occurs in the fall of 1935. A union rep named Danny Dry Hands Molinari has been skimming from dues collected from seamstresses. Not enough to draw immediate attention, but enough to anger Tommy's accountants. Rather than threaten Danny, Tommy invites him for lunch. They eat in silence. Tommy orders the chicken cutlet. Danny orders nothing. After a few sips of wine, Tommy slides a receipt across the table. "You want to tell me where the missing 2,300 went?" he asks softly. Danny stammers. Tommy doesn't press. He just keeps eating. Later that night, Danny resigns. The next morning, a new rep, one of Tommy's choosing, takes the seat. No violence, no scars, just repositioning. That's how Tommy builds. Not with wrecking balls, with quiet replacements. It's around this time that he starts earning a new nickname, one whispered half-jokingly in barbershops and diners. Three-button Lucchese. Not because of fashion, but because Tommy can supposedly solve any problem in 3 phone calls or less. A contract dispute, a missing crate, a nosy detective, 3 calls, no more, no less. Of course, the truth behind this nickname is probably more myth than method. But Tommy doesn't mind. In fact, he lets the legend float. He understands what all great leaders understand. A little mystery is more powerful than a lot of explanation. By 1936, the structure of his family begins to formalize. Lieutenants are placed. Revenue streams are diversified. His influence extends into trucking, dry cleaning, and even certain delicatessens that serve as impromptu message hubs. These aren't just businesses, they're pressure points, places where money flows and information pulses, and Tommy taps into each like a doctor with a stethoscope. One of the most significant moves he makes is establishing tight control over the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America, a major union with deep roots in the garment industry. But Tommy doesn't seize control in a blaze of intimidation. Instead, he attends meetings, funds community dinners, helps settle disputes between shop owners and workers. His name is never on a ballot, but somehow, his choices always win. Many people still think Lucchese simply owned the union through bribes and threats, but records suggest something more nuanced. He embedded himself in the machinery, not to break it, but to steer it. When union bosses got too greedy, he reined them in. When they got scared, he reassured them. He was, oddly enough, the calm in the storm, and that calmness begins attracting attention. Tommy receives an invitation to a fundraising gala for a prominent city councilman. It's the kind of event where mobsters usually stay far, far away. But Tommy shows up, dressed sharp, no entourage. He donates a modest sum, shakes exactly 5 hands, eats half a cannoli, then leaves. The next week, 2 new waste disposal contracts go to companies in his orbit. The city is beginning to understand. Tommy Lucchese doesn't break down doors. He installs locks and hands out the keys. His home life, meanwhile, remains famously quiet. A modest house in Long Island. No lavish parties. Just a garden out back, a dog that barks at the mailman, and a schedule as predictable as the tides. Neighbors think he's in insurance. He never corrects them. On Sundays, he cooks. Red sauce from scratch. Jazz on the radio. He reads the paper, pays his bills, and goes for a walk. No bodyguards. No tension. Just a man in a fedora watching the ducks. Do you remember the story about the time his neighbor's roof collapsed during a snowstorm? Tommy showed up the next morning with contractors, covered the cost. No questions asked. The neighbor still doesn't know why, but the message was clear. Lucchese was the kind of man who helped quietly and remembered everything. Of course, the FBI isn't fooled by the garden and the jazz. They begin tracking his movements more closely. Surveillance teams are posted outside his office, his favorite lunch spots, even his tailor. But all they see is a man having calm conversations over espresso. No threats, no cash exchanges, no obvious criminal activity. One agent writes in his report, Lucchese operates like a surgeon who never picks up a scalpel, but the real work is being done in coded conversations, nods, and rearranged schedules. Tommy isn't avoiding detection. He's using it as cover. The more they see him doing nothing, the less they suspect the everything he's doing elsewhere. And always, the empire expands, not in leaps, but in increments, like a tide rising so slowly you don't notice your feet are wet. By 1937, Lucchese controls more of New York's clothing industry than any single politician or business magnate. Not officially, of course. But ask the right people where to move fabric without getting robbed, or how to avoid a union strike, or who can ensure that your truck arrives on time. Every road leads back to Tommy, and all of it, every thread and every crate, flows through that second-floor room above the florist's shop. By the time the Castellammarese War sputters into uneasy peace and Lucky Luciano ascends as the architect of modern organized crime, Tommy Lucchese finds himself with an empire not earned through bullets, but balance. The dust of the old world is settling, and a new, sleeker mob economy is taking form. One where rackets are routinized, territory is negotiated like stock options, and the men who rise are those who can think 3 moves ahead. And Tommy? He's already thinking 5. In a world where names like Genovese and Gambino crackle with notoriety, Lucchese is building something more subtle, something that doesn't need to be shouted to be respected. He begins centralizing his family's operations with the grace of a man organizing a dinner party rather than a criminal empire. He doesn't consolidate by force, but through structure, patience, and, when necessary, a nudge that feels more like gravity than threat. One of his early defining moves as boss is investing in the garment trucking routes, not just controlling the unions, but the flow of the goods themselves. If the garments are the blood of the district, the trucks are the veins. Tommy doesn't want a cut. He wants the bloodstream, so he creates a series of shell companies. Some look like real logistics firms. Some are real logistics firms. He even installs managers with legitimate resumes, guys who used to work for Macy's or freight lines out of Newark. The trick isn't hiding the criminality. It's camouflaging it so deeply in the everyday that no one wants to look closely. One day in 1938, a shipment of imported wool from Montreal goes missing somewhere between the docks and Midtown. The buyer panics, calls the warehouse, then the union rep, then a city contact. Finally, someone whispers, "Call Lucchese." Tommy doesn't answer the phone. He never does for these things. But by noon the next day, the shipment is back, miraculously found in a secondary storage unit, accidentally mislabeled. The buyer never asks questions again. He just sends a bottle of scotch and a thank you note. That's the kind of power Lucchese prefers. No guns, no blood, just results. Around this time, Tommy starts developing relationships with two key figures, Meyer Lansky and Joe Adonis. Now, Lansky, brilliant, calculating, almost algebraic in his logic, is a natural partner for Tommy. They both value efficiency, discretion, and infrastructure. Their conversations, people say, are less about who's next and more about what's next. Investments, routes, foreign ports, the future. Adonis, on the other hand, is all charm and street swagger, but even he can't deny Lucchese's rise. Tommy's the guy you want fixing your roof, he once joked. Not flashy, just quiet, dry, and permanent. But Lucchese isn't just dealing with allies. He's also navigating rivals, particularly Vito Genovese, a man as ambitious as he is volatile. Genovese respects Tommy, but doesn't understand him. What does he do? Vito once asked Luciano in frustration. Lucky laughed. He does everything, he just doesn't do it loud, and it's true. While Genovese and others jostle for headlines and rank, Tommy builds a scaffolding no one sees until they're already standing on it. One of Lucchese's key innovations is in payroll. No, not laundering it, but standardizing it. He sets regular payout schedules for his crew, predictable envelopes, no guessing, no shorting, no come back Tuesday. You'd think it was a municipal job the way he ran it. And that kind of consistency builds loyalty the way threats never could. Many people still think that mob power came down to who had the most soldiers, the best shooters. But Tommy's greatest weapon was something quieter, stability. His men didn't have to hustle to survive. They just had to stay useful and respectful. Do you remember the name Vincent Beans Arlotta? Small-time enforcer turned errand boy. He made the mistake of pocketing a little extra from a numbers run, just a few $100. Other bosses might have had him dumped in a canal. Tommy? He invited Beans to his office, offered him espresso, asked if he liked his job. Beans nodded, nervous. Tommy smiled. Then don't steal from it. Beans returned every cent, and was never disloyal again. That's how Lucchese ruled, with measured words and the sense that second chances weren't given twice. Meanwhile, his ties to labor deepen. By the early 1940s, he's the invisible hand behind a half-dozen unions, not just the garment ones, but trucking, food distribution, and even restaurant workers. His influence reaches into hotel kitchens and backstage theaters. If you needed uniforms, linens, meat, or liquor in bulk, there was a decent chance Tommy's crew touched it. The scope of his control amazes even his contemporaries. Carlo Gambino, famously laconic, once remarked, "Lucchese has his own city within the city, but Tommy never flaunts it. He drives modest cars, lives in a quiet neighborhood. His biggest indulgence? A handmade Italian overcoat he wears like armor. That, and a fondness for fresh cannoli. One afternoon, as World War II stretches into its final years, Lucchese walks through the garment district with an out-of-town associate. The associate marvels at the scale, the trucks, the people, the movement. "You own all this?" he asks. Tommy shrugs. "I keep it running." That's his magic. Ownership isn't about names on deeds. It's about being the one everyone calls when something goes wrong, and the one they never thank when it goes right. The FBI, of course, is paying attention. They increase surveillance, tap phones, flip bookies, and tail warehouse clerks. But Lucchese remains an enigma. They have pictures of him entering buildings, shaking hands, sitting in diners, but no crimes, no quotes, no leverage. One agent describes him as a chess player who hides his pieces after every move. Even the IRS takes a swing, trying to audit his real estate holdings. But Tommy's smart. Properties are in other names, trusts, companies within companies. He's not above the law, he's behind it, like a man pulling the curtain in a puppet show. And as his reputation grows, so does his reach. His influence begins creeping into construction, scaffolding firms, cement companies, electricians. If a building is going up in Midtown, Tommy's fingerprints are probably on a permit, a pipe, or a payroll slip. Still, he keeps the same office, same desk, same flower shop below. A city of 10 million people, and his empire hums from a room smaller than your average deli. What makes Lucchese different, what truly separates him from his peers, isn't just his strategy. It's his refusal to believe in chaos. He doesn't like emergencies, doesn't tolerate surprises. He believes deeply that crime, like industry, should run on a schedule. And that belief, that obsession with order, it's about to help him reshape the mafia itself. The war ends, and New York returns to business. But business now wears a new face. Slicker, faster, more ambitious. Construction cranes dot the skyline. Trucks roll heavier. Men in suits start talking about suburbs instead of street corners. But underneath it all, in the rivets and the receipts, Tommy Lucchese continues to weave his web. Not with flair, but with frightening consistency. The end of the 1940s sees many crime families scrambling. The old ways are failing. Brute force isn't enough anymore. The FBI is getting smarter, politicians slipperier. Yet through all of this, Lucchese's family not only survives, it thrives. Quietly, efficiently, almost politely. And a big reason? The commission. When Lucky Luciano sets up the commission in 1931, a sort of mob United Nations meant to prevent wars between the five families, he knows he needs more than muscle at that table. He needs architects, strategists, and Lucchese, even then, is already known for being the only man who can settle a territorial dispute without drawing a map or blood. The commission meetings are famously tense affairs. Picture it, a dim room, cigarette smoke curling through the air, 5 bosses each pretending not to be worried about the other's ambitions. And Tommy? He sits slightly back, eyes half-lidded, fingers steepled. He doesn't interrupt, doesn't grandstand. But when tempers flare, when Anastasia bangs a fist or Genovese snarls through his teeth, Tommy calmly clears his throat, says 2 sentences, and the storm passes. One such moment becomes legend. 1951. During a dispute between the Profaci and Bonanno factions over waterfront kickbacks, both sides are ready to walk. Voices rise, a glass breaks, and then Lucchese leans in and mutters something to Gambino, barely audible to the others. Whatever it was, it causes Gambino to nod slowly and whisper to his cousin on the Profaci side. Suddenly, the air cools. The room settles. The handshake comes 10 minutes later. No one ever learns what Tommy said. That's the thing. He doesn't need volume. He's the stillness that rearranges everyone else's chaos. His ability to navigate these volatile waters earns him a nickname in certain circles, Il Tessitore, the Weaver. Because every thread, labor, politics, rackets, rivals, somehow gets drawn into his loom and emerges as part of the larger design. Do you remember the time when Genovese tried to force a new truck tax on garment haulers in East Harlem? Everyone expected Lucchese to push back violently. Instead, he hosted a dinner. Linguine, Chianti, jazz in the background. Halfway through the meal, Genovese's representative is laughing. By dessert, the tax proposal has been delayed indefinitely. And Lucchese? He never raises his voice above the music. This is his style. But he's not just a diplomat. He's an innovator. Take the trucking racket. Most bosses just slap their name on a route and collect. But Tommy restructures the entire system. He ensures deliveries happen on time. He eliminates double booking. He even implements a maintenance stipend that keeps trucks in working order, because nothing disrupts profit like a blown axle at rush hour. One FBI wiretap captures a truck driver saying, "Working for Lucchese is like working for the post office. Rain or shine, the job gets done, and nobody yells." That kind of operational discipline is unheard of in mob circles. But Tommy doesn't care about traditions. He cares about results. Even his approach to bribes reflects this philosophy. He doesn't throw money at problems. He researches, learns a judge's favorite wine, a city clerk's daughter's piano recital schedule, a councilman's side business. He doesn't buy people. He earns their reliance. By the late 40s, he begins to focus on a new industry, air freight. The world is changing. Planes are faster. Luggage holds are bigger. Airports are becoming hubs of commerce. And Lucchese sees something most of his peers don't. Cargo is the future, so he begins making quiet inroads at LaGuardia and Newark. He places men in warehouse positions, helps promote union leaders who understand the importance of discretion. He doesn't announce these moves. He just ensures that certain shipments, those full of jewelry, furs, or imported silks, start arriving just a little slower, and only through doors he controls. Historians still debate the full scope of Lucchese's influence on air freight. Many people still think that the airlines themselves were unaware of how deep mob fingers went into cargo manifests. But others insist. Without Lucchese's nod, certain crates simply didn't fly. And then there's the politics. Tommy's friendship with Carmine DeSapio matures into something far more potent in the late 40s. DeSapio, a rising star in Tammany Hall, becomes a valuable conduit between city government and Lucchese's network. The two men never appear in public together. But construction permits, waste disposal contracts, and zoning decisions start falling in Lucchese's favor with alarming regularity. They say Tommy once got a city council vote flipped with a single phone call, but if that call happened, no one ever heard it. Even the police begin to soften around him. Not because he's paying them off, but because he doesn't cause noise. When someone is murdered in Manhattan, it's rarely a Lucchese man. When shipments are stolen, his crew returns them before complaints are filed. He becomes useful, like an emergency generator. When things break, Tommy knows how to get them running again, and he never forgets a favor. Do you remember the story about the bakery strike in Brooklyn? A union rep demanded double pay for holiday shifts. The bakeries revolted. Shelves went empty, panic set in, and in walked Lucchese, smiling. 2 meetings later, a compromise was reached. No one got rich, but the shelves stayed full, and the union voted to re-elect their boss unanimously. No one could prove Tommy brokered the deal, but his brother-in-law's cousin suddenly owned a delivery route through 3 boroughs. Coincidence? Doubtful. And all the while, the Lucchese family remains stable. No coups, no public power struggles. While other families tear themselves apart, Colombo's infighting, Bonanno's rebellion, Tommy's men stay quiet, paid, loyal, respected. Even his lieutenants speak about him with reverence. "He's not just our boss," one was overheard saying. "He's our planner." Another, "You work for Tommy? You know where you stand. You don't have to watch your back." He already did, and that's the secret. Lucchese doesn't rule through fear. He rules through forethought, through preparation, through the comforting hum of predictability. His empire isn't the flashiest. It doesn't make headlines, but it endures, like a city bus that always arrives on time, even when no one thanks the driver. The 1950s begin not with a bang in Tommy Lucchese's world, but with a rustle of ledgers, of paper bags, of quiet favors passed hand to hand. New York is changing rapidly. The skyline is rising. Television is replacing radio. Suburbia is bleeding workers from downtown. But the garment district still breathes steady, and the trucks still roll down narrow streets carrying bolts of silk, cash-stuffed envelopes, and the silent fingerprints of Lucchese's network. Now in his 50s, Tommy has mastered something few mobsters ever do: invisibility with impact. He rarely leaves a trace, but his decisions move hundreds of thousands of dollars, shape union policy, and determine which freight docks operate without delay. He doesn't walk into meetings anymore. Meetings form around him. It's in this decade that Tommy begins to refine the very heart of his power. Influence by proximity. Not intimidation, not orders, just presence. He sits at the edge of a restaurant booth while city officials, district leaders, and businessmen shuffle in and out. They don't get instructions from him. They get clarity, reassurance, direction. Sometimes he doesn't even speak. A nod, a glance, a hand resting on the table for just a second longer than usual. That's all it takes. The language of a man who long ago realized words are often less effective than weather. One of his favorite haunts during this time is a small Italian eatery in the Bronx. White tablecloths, low ceilings. Always smells like garlic and fresh bread. Booth in the back. Same one every time. On a Tuesday in April 1952, a young union official named Jerry Ferraro is brought there by one of Lucchese's men. Jerry's been causing ripples, asking questions about dues, breaking tradition with suggested audits. Tommy sits him down, orders 2 glasses of wine, doesn't accuse, doesn't threaten. "You ever go fishing?" Tommy asks. Jerry hesitates. "Not really. You should try it. It teaches you to be patient, and it reminds you. Some things stay under the water for a reason." Nothing more is said. Jerry finishes his wine, leaves, and 2 days later, withdraws his complaints. He gets promoted 6 months later. Coincidence? Maybe. Maybe not. But the message is clear. Lucchese doesn't just control money, he controls tempo. Do you remember that brief strike that almost crippled the fashion district in late '53? Everyone was bracing for a shutdown. Politicians scrambled, reporters readied their headlines, but then a miracle. Compromise, a renegotiated wage, an agreement between management and labor. No public savior was named, but insiders knew it was Lucchese, not by force, by facilitation. That's his signature. Not red ink, but absence of black eyes. And while his influence deepens in labor, his reach into legitimate enterprise grows quietly through the 50s. Trucking routes become intertwined with municipal contracts. Cleaning companies linked to his men win sanitation deals in Queens. A quiet word from Lucchese ensures that restaurants on 9th Avenue get their linens on time, and their inspections passed. He even begins dipping into cultural institutions. A quiet rumor floats through city art circles that a sudden donation to the opera came through a friend of the tailoring trade. No name attached. But the seat that donation bought? Always left empty, except once a year when Lucchese's wife attends a matinee alone. Tommy, for all his power, remains devoted to his family, not the mob family, the one at home. He takes his wife out every Sunday, same restaurant, same table. When his daughter gets married, he throws a quiet reception, small, tasteful, no gold fountains or orchestras, just a few long tables, fine pasta, and guests who know better than to bring cameras. He's also a man of habits. Up by 6, coffee with 1 sugar, daily papers arranged in a specific order, reports from his top men reviewed by 10. By noon, decisions have been made, calls returned, notes passed, and by 2, he's either taking a walk or sitting with someone who doesn't even realize the conversation they're in is life-changing. Lucchese's calendar looks empty, but only because everything runs ahead of schedule. Even his rivals begin to acknowledge this quiet efficiency. Joe Bonanno once remarked, "With Tommy, you never know if you're being managed until you realize you've been happy about it the whole time." And the commission? They trust him more than any other figure, perhaps more than they trust each other. He becomes a sort of consigliere to the commission itself, a balancing force among personalities like Genovese, Gambino, and Profaci. When someone needs a tie-breaking vote or a back-channel message relayed, it's Tommy who gets the nod, but he doesn't seek glory. In fact, when a rising capo in another family brags about having Tommy's ear, Lucchese quietly pulls him aside. "Don't talk like that," he says with a smile. "Ears close when people get loud." The young man stops bragging. The lesson sticks. Around this time, Tommy starts hosting what insiders call maintenance meetings, small gatherings, no more than 5 people. Always the same formula. Espresso, biscotti, one topic. A problem is laid out, options reviewed, a solution emerges, almost always the one Tommy had in mind before the meeting began. These meetings aren't about decisions, they're about alignment. Lucchese doesn't rule like a king. He operates like a watchmaker, fine-tuning gears to ensure the hands never skip a second. And while he maintains this carefully structured world, the outside one starts changing again. Television brings new scrutiny. Journalists are bolder. The FBI under Hoover is less patient. Wiretaps are everywhere. But Lucchese's record remains clean. No convictions, no fiery quotes, no late-night arrests. One FBI memo calls him the most frustrating target in New York, polite, punctual, and completely untouchable. Even when a young agent plants a bug in Tommy's flower shop office, the tapes yield nothing but small talk, weather discussions, and the occasional joke about the Yankees bullpen. Yet those who understand the layers know that underneath every weather comment is a code. That jokes about baseball games sometimes reflect real-time shifts in routes, supply chains, and political tides. He's not speaking plainly because he never has to. One of the most impressive expansions under Lucchese's quiet empire happens in building contracts. Through a network of contractors, suppliers, and city permits, his family begins taking a share of construction across Manhattan and the Bronx. Not just skyscrapers, but schools, hospitals, roads, and again, no one's quite sure how. A bricklayer on 38th Street says he just works where he's told. A supplier says he only knows one distributor. A union man says, "We got lucky with this job." But look closely and you'll find the pattern. Lucchese's men in every layer, holding every bolt, signing every line. By 1958, one senator investigating organized labor says, "If Mr. Lucchese were elected mayor tomorrow, the city might run even better. And that should terrify you." But Tommy, he just smiles when he hears the quote, sips his espresso, and says to no one in particular, "Better's a dangerous word," because he knows better can always turn into noticed. And noticed is what he's spent his whole life avoiding. It's 1959, and New York doesn't sleep anymore. It buzzes. Neon lights flicker over diners, cabs honk through narrowed lanes, and television antennas stab the skyline like quills scratching across the new American page. But while the city reinvents itself above ground, Tommy Lucchese continues to rule from the folds, behind curtains, within contracts, beneath the hum of fluorescent lights in warehouses. No one tours without an escort. And the best part? No one ever hears his name. By now, the Lucchese family is a machine, oiled, clocked, and nearly invisible. The violence that plagues other families seems absent here. While Bonanno's men feud and Colombo's loyalists jockey for positions, Tommy's lieutenants sip coffee in peace, handle disputes over biscotti, and rarely miss payroll. It's not utopia. It's orchestration. And no one orchestrates better than Lucchese. One of his favorite domains, quietly growing under his nose, is the airport. Idlewild Airport, later renamed JFK, is becoming a new center of commerce, and Tommy is already several years ahead of everyone else. He understands something few others do. Air cargo isn't just modern, it's malleable. No borders, no street corners, just manifests and misplaced crates. He starts slowly. A warehouse guard with a cousin on the docks, a cargo loader who's tired of the night shift, a scheduler who drinks more than he writes down. It's like watching a spider build its web, not all at once, but with precise movements, each thread attached to something forgotten. By 1960, the Lucchese family has informal control over major cargo routes coming into New York through Idlewild. Stolen goods begin vanishing into customs black holes. Crates labeled textiles carry more than silk, and no one complains because deliveries still arrive on time and jobs stay steady. One airline executive, suspected of cooperating with mob-linked freight handlers, is asked during a quiet federal interview if he knows Tommy Lucchese. He blinks, confused. "No," he says, "but I know the union president, and he's always calm. That's what Tommy does. He makes everyone else look competent while he pulls the levers behind the curtain. He doesn't appear in photos. He rarely appears in court. But every now and then, a curious headline hints at his presence. City construction boom raises eyebrows, over contractor selection, or laundry service monopoly under investigation, ties to unions still unclear. But no follow-ups, no arrests, just whispers. Back at the commission, Tommy becomes the consensus maker, the referee. When Anastasia is assassinated in a barbershop in 1957, a hit that stuns even the most jaded insiders, it's Lucchese who helps settle the storm. Not with vengeance, but with balance. He gathers the bosses. He lays out the risks. He outlines the benefits of moving forward. Quietly, that's the moment when Carlo Gambino, always one to see potential, draws closer. The two men form one of the most quietly powerful partnerships in mafia history. Gambino, cold and calculating, understands ambition. Lucchese, patient and precise, understands systems. Together, they begin shaping the landscape, not for the next few months, but for the next few decades. One example? Garbage. It sounds mundane. But by 1961, New York sanitation contracts are a multi-million-dollar ecosystem of routes, fees, and sweetened deals. Lucchese sees the opportunity not in the trash, but in the structure. Control the trucks, influence the landfills, manage the schedules, and you control a third of the city's heartbeat. So, he partners with Gambino-linked firms and quietly acquires influence in key zones. Bids are submitted, competitors disappear, and soon, entire neighborhoods are serviced by men who answer to Lucchese lieutenants. And still, no one says his name. Many people still think Tommy Lucchese avoided media scrutiny because he kept his hands clean. But those inside the life know better. He didn't avoid scrutiny. He made scrutiny boring. He wrapped it in process, delayed it with documentation, and diluted it with plausible deniability. One journalist once tried to write a feature on Lucchese's reach. After 3 months of interviews, he scrapped it, muttering, "It's like chasing smoke through a keyhole." Meanwhile, Tommy's image remains pristine, at least by mob standards. His suits are flawless, his shoes always polished, and his speech always kind, never coarse. The kind of voice that makes judges shake his hand and forget their own rulings. He even cultivates a reputation for generosity. Around Christmas, his crews hand out envelopes to shopkeepers, small ones, just enough to buy dinner. He sends a donation to a burned-down church in the Bronx, pays for a local boy's hospital bills, all quietly, all with no press. But the streets remember. Do you remember the butcher in East Harlem whose shop got robbed 3 times in a month? After the 3rd break-in, Tommy paid him a visit. Not with threats, but with advice. "Install a second lock," he said, "and take Sunday off. No one ever robbed that butcher again." That's the thing. Lucchese didn't rule by fear. He ruled by inevitability. Oppose him, and you found yourself gently frozen out. Suppliers stopped calling, trucks got delayed, inspectors visited more often. Nothing dramatic, just a slow fade until your business dried up like bread left out too long. He used pressure like a chiropractor. Firm, calculated, and always where it hurts just enough to make you reconsider your posture. But even with all this control, Tommy never let his men believe they were invincible. He constantly reminded them, the moment you think you're untouchable is the moment they write your name in ink. He stayed humble, cautious, and most of all, in control. His office, still above the flower shop, hadn't changed. Same curtains, same calendar, same ashtray from 1948. Visitors would remark on the lack of grandeur. One once asked, "Why not move to Midtown?" Tommy just smiled. "Why move a machine that's not broken?" And it wasn't. The Lucchese family, thanks to decades of quiet, deliberate expansion, had become the most stable criminal enterprise in New York. Others rose faster. Others burned brighter. But Tommy Lucchese, he built something better. He built something that worked. Tommy Lucchese doesn't believe in chaos. Not because he thinks the world is tidy, but because he knows that most disorder is the result of poor planning. To Lucchese, every mess is a decision someone failed to make on time. And by 1962, he's made just about every decision worth making. Quietly, efficiently, and long before anyone noticed, there was a choice to be made at all. The garment industry hums with synchronized precision. The air cargo operations, running out of both Idlewild and Newark, function like international clockwork. And now, Lucchese is looking at the one institution that affects everything from construction permits to liquor licenses, from waste management to school lunch contracts, City Hall. He doesn't want to own it. He wants to nudge it. So, he goes back to an old friend, Carmine DeSapio. Still deeply embedded in Tammany Hall's inner gears, DeSapio represents the crumbling but not yet dead political machine that once ran New York like a family recipe. Lucchese doesn't ask for laws to be changed. He just wants the paperwork to move faster, the inspections to stay where they belong, and the right contractors to win the right bids. In return, Tommy makes sure the trash gets picked up on time in DeSapio's district, and that no scandal ever sticks longer than a rain puddle. One winter afternoon, a reporter trying to investigate corruption in city contracting asks a clerk about Lucchese's name. The clerk looks puzzled. "Tommy Lucchese?" he says. "I think he runs a dry cleaner on Delancey." The perfect cover. Not because it's convincing, but because no one thinks to check. And as construction booms throughout the 60s, new highways, hospitals, schools, Lucchese's reach expands like ivy across stone. He doesn't micromanage every site. He doesn't need to. All he has to do is make sure his people control the lumber yards, the trucking schedules, the concrete suppliers. Everything else falls in line. One example, the public library expansion in the Bronx. The winning contractor is a man named Frankie Lupo. Quiet, clean record, reasonably priced. What's not in the paperwork, Lupo's brother-in-law is a Lucchese captain, and the cement comes from a firm with 5 shell companies in Jersey, all of which trace back, if you dig hard enough, to a flower shop office with lace curtains. And then there's the cultural side of the empire. Lucchese begins to support certain community projects, not out of image building, but to grease the gears. He donates to parks, pays for benches, helps restore a small church's stained glass window. Nothing grand, no plaques, just enough to remind the neighborhood who keeps the lights on. Do you remember the old Italian social club on Mott Street that reopened in 1963 after a suspicious fire? New paint, new pool table, new roof. No official fundraiser, just a quiet delivery of materials, a few contractors who never submitted invoices, and a thank you card sent to a name that wasn't on the books. Meanwhile, Lucchese's family members, his real family, stay low-key. His wife attends Mass. His daughter hosts dinner parties with teachers and doctors. Neighbors describe the Lucchese home as unusually peaceful. One even says, "I never saw him raise his voice or his lawn chair." But back in the underworld, Tommy is revered. Not just respected, studied. Younger mobsters are instructed to watch how he handles disputes, how he gives orders without raising his hand, how his meetings never run longer than they need to. There's a saying now, whispered among new recruits. If you have to explain it, you're not doing it the Lucchese way. He even begins mentoring. A young capo named Carmine Tramonti catches Tommy's eye. Smart, patient, not greedy. Tommy brings him close, not to coddle, but to observe. Tramonti becomes a kind of unofficial apprentice, not the next king, but the next engineer. Someone to keep the machine running when the master steps away. FBI surveillance picks up their lunches together, though the conversations are maddeningly bland. Baseball, church renovations, a new bakery on Grand Avenue. Not a single word that sticks. One agent writes in frustration, "I think Lucchese is actually just boring, if only they knew." Because even now, with the FBI doubling its efforts, even as more mobsters get hauled in for conspiracy and tax evasion, Tommy remains untouched. Not because he's untouchable, but because he has nothing to grab onto. No statements, no slips, not even a smirk. It's around this time that an unexpected visitor comes calling, a U.S. senator investigating organized labor. He wants a meeting, not publicly, of course, but a private conversation to understand the structure. The message is delivered through 2 intermediaries. Tommy's reply? "Tell him to read the paper. That's what I do." He's not being rude, he's being surgical. Any contact like that? Exposure. And exposure is noise. And noise ruins sleep. So instead, Tommy focuses inward, streamlining payouts, adjusting the commission system for his crews, setting up a quiet pension fund, yes, a pension fund, for retired earners who served without scandal. It's not generosity, it's continuity. A man who feels secure in his sunset years doesn't come back desperate. He stays loyal. That's what Lucchese trades in. Not loyalty built on fear, loyalty built on peace. And peace, in Tommy's world, is a business decision. He even starts inviting certain men to early retirement, politely. He offers options. Florida if they prefer sun. Jersey if they prefer silence. But always with the same tone. You've earned your rest. Let the next guy mop the floors, and they go. Because when Tommy Lucchese tells you to rest, you rest. Meanwhile, construction around the city continues to blossom. Projects rise, unions stay quiet, and trucks never miss their morning call. Reporters occasionally sniff around, but they never get far. One famously describes Lucchese's empire as a network of ghosts in hard hats. Even within the 5 families, there's growing awareness that Lucchese's model might be the future. Not because it's revolutionary, but because it works. Smooth, predictable, profitable. Many people still think the mob was all about power through fear. But Tommy shows something else entirely. Power through function. When everything moves smoothly, when everyone gets paid, when no one dies unless absolutely necessary, well, then you've built something that doesn't just survive, it lasts, and that's the plan. While others chase headlines, Lucchese is chasing legacy, not statues, not ballads, but a system so well built it keeps running long after the architect has stepped away from the blueprint. And step away he soon will, but not yet. A man like Tommy Lucchese doesn't just build an empire, he tunes it. By the early 1960s, the machine he's engineered hums so precisely that even its flaws seem planned. Mistakes don't escalate, they get reassigned. Threats don't boil, they get diffused. And every operator in the system, from the guy driving a linen truck to the man skimming union dues, knows the rules haven't changed in 20 years. Lucchese's greatest strength? Predictability. That predictability is why, by 1963, Lucchese becomes something almost unheard of in mafia lore. A welcome guest in places where mobsters aren't even supposed to exist. City officials, those with delicate ambitions and risk-averse hearts, begin quietly inviting Tommy to dinner. Not for favors, for stability. They know the economy is messy, that labor tensions can explode like unlit fuses, and they've started to realize something uncomfortable. If Tommy Lucchese says a strike won't happen, it doesn't. If he says a deal will go through, it does. If he doesn't return your call, well, you'd better rethink your strategy. One such event occurs at a midtown fundraiser for a mayoral hopeful. Tuxedos, champagne, big promises. Tommy arrives without a tie, wearing a suit that whispers handmade in Palermo. He says nothing flashy, doesn't shake many hands. But by the end of the night, the candidate's press secretary is taking meetings with a consultant whose real resume begins and ends with "Tommy sent me." That's the thing. Tommy never walks through the front door. He rearranges the furniture until you open it for him. Meanwhile, his partnership with Carlo Gambino evolves into something closer to a silent merger. Their families don't fuse, but their operations do. Gambino handles the flashier rackets, gambling, extortion, Atlantic City. Tommy handles logistics, labor, international shipments, and the contracts no one sees coming. Together, they reshape how power flows, not as waves, but as tides. One joint venture, quietly launched in 1964, involves the longshoremen's unions at the Brooklyn waterfront. For decades, these unions have been hotbeds of chaos, strikes, injuries, missing cargo. But Lucchese and Gambino send in their own version of a cleanup crew. Administrators, not enforcers. Within 6 months, theft drops. Shipments arrive faster. Dock workers suddenly have health benefits that actually exist. The press calls it a labor miracle. The FBI calls it concerning. Neither is wrong, because behind the scenes, Tommy's family now takes a percentage of every cargo ship that docks between Red Hook and Staten Island. It's not extortion. It's consulting, as his men like to joke. One of his underbosses describes it like this: Tommy doesn't squeeze, he partners. You don't feel robbed, you feel supported. And then you realize your whole company wears shoes he picked out. By now, law enforcement is desperate to pin anything on Lucchese. They bug restaurants. They flip small-time earners. They follow envelopes like bloodhounds. Nothing. There's an infamous surveillance tape from 1965 where an FBI agent records Lucchese dining with two union officials. They talk about golf, a niece's wedding, tomato season, 45 minutes of soft laughter, polite compliments, and a discussion about whether it's acceptable to refrigerate olive oil. When the agents review the tape, they sit in silence. One finally says, either this guy is clean or he's Mozart. But just because he's hard to catch doesn't mean he's not being watched. Every move is now analyzed like scripture, and in that pressure, Tommy only becomes sharper. He stops taking meetings in obvious places, switches cars twice a week, keeps an old police radio by his desk, not to listen, but to know. He also begins prepping for what comes next. Carmine Tramonti, his longtime protege, is brought in closer. Tommy doesn't say much about succession. He just starts letting Carmine make decisions, watches him, corrects quietly when needed. The same way a violinist trains his fingers before handing the bow to someone else. At the same time, Lucchese expands his influence over who gets into politics, not just which bills pass. Local races, school boards, zoning committees. He starts backing candidates, not through donations, but through momentum. A few key endorsements, a nudge from a labor group, a mysteriously timed plumbing inspection for the opponent. Do you remember Councilman Radovich from Queens? Elected in a landslide in 1966. What wasn't reported: 3 of his campaign signs were printed by a company run by Lucchese's cousin. Coincidence? Maybe. But when Radovich later votes to expand a trucking route through East Elmhurst, guess whose shell companies start appearing on the contracts? Lucchese understands something deeper than policy. He understands people. He knows that most men, given the illusion of freedom, will choose the path of least resistance. All he has to do is make sure that path leads to him. But for all this growth, Lucchese never loses his core habits. He still reads 4 newspapers a day, still eats lunch with the same group of men, most of whom aren't made guys, but childhood friends, tradesmen, retired cops. He likes their stories, their normalcy. It keeps him grounded, and he never ever raises his voice. One day, a new associate, young, brash, interrupts a sit-down with a story about a new way to move betting slips that's revolutionary. Tommy listens, nods once, then looks him in the eye and says, "Revolutions are messy. I prefer trains." That associate is never invited back. Tommy's world is about precision. And by 1967, every moving part in his world seems to click. But the thing about perfect machines is, they eventually wear. That year, Lucchese begins to feel something unusual. Fatigue. It's subtle at first. A tightness in the chest. A cough that won't leave. He visits a doctor under a different name. The diagnosis is careful but clear. Signs of a malignancy. He doesn't panic, doesn't change course. He tells no one outside his most inner circle. Not even Gambino hears it from him directly. Instead, Lucchese gets more organized. He reviews ledgers with new urgency, reassigns responsibilities with surgical calm, calls in long unseen associates just to check on their comfort, and, most telling, He begins tidying his loose ends. Not debts, not vendettas, details. A rumor circulates that Lucchese requested all old meeting notes, coded of course, be reviewed and destroyed. Another rumor says he wrote personal letters to every man who'd served him more than 20 years. No threats, no instructions. Just, thank you for keeping your head when others lost theirs. And even as the illness begins to sap him, Lucchese remains present. Every day at the office, every espresso stirred with a slow hand, every jacket folded just so over the back of his chair, because if he's leaving the stage, he's not going to stumble off it. He's going to step, quietly, gracefully, while the music still plays. The illness settles in slowly, like a fog that refuses to lift. Tommy Lucchese, once brisk and punctual as a clock, begins arriving just a little later. His suits, though still pressed to perfection, now hang slightly looser. He still reads the papers, still sips espresso with the quiet dignity of a man who's outlived too many headlines. But the energy, that invisible current, begins to ebb. The men around him notice. Of course they do, but they don't speak it aloud, not because they're afraid. Tommy never ruled by fear, but because to name it would be to confirm that even the steadiest pillar can begin to tilt. And no one wants to see the machine without the mechanic. He senses it too, so he begins what only a few mobsters have ever dared attempt: succession with dignity. He starts by delegating without disappearing. Carmine Tremonti takes on more responsibilities. Some obvious, like managing payouts. Others subtle, like approving meeting locations and greenlighting new contacts. Tommy watches it all like a composer easing back on the baton, allowing the orchestra to carry the melody. But every so often, he still steps in, with precision. One such moment occurs in spring of '67, when a dispute arises between two trucking companies vying for a city contract in the Bronx. Both have loose ties to Lucchese. Both expect his support. Neither wants to back down. Tensions rise. Tommy calls a meeting. Not in the flower shop office, but in a quiet Italian restaurant that's been serving osso buco since Prohibition. The two parties sit across from him, nervous, trying not to sweat into their marinara. Lucchese doesn't threaten, doesn't even raise his voice. He just listens, then says, "You're both good at what you do, so do it on different days." The compromise is so simple it almost sounds like a joke, but it works. A shared contract, alternating delivery schedules. Both men leave relieved, grateful, loyal. That's the last direct mediation Tommy ever handles. From there, he becomes more like a ghost, present, but quieter. His phone calls shorten. His public appearances vanish. Even his neighbors notice. One says, he used to trim the hedges every Saturday. Then one day, he just sat and watched the garden grow. But behind closed doors, the work continues. Lucchese spends long hours reviewing financial records, not to audit, but to understand. He wants every dollar accounted for, every contact up to date. He treats it less like a crime family and more like a dynasty that needs its books in order before the patriarch steps away. One evening, he calls in 3 of his most senior men. No ceremony, no wine, just folded chairs in his living room. He gives each man a single envelope, contents unknown to all but the recipient, and simply says, "Protect what we built. Don't make it louder, make it last." None of them ever speak about what was inside, and he doesn't summon them again. What's remarkable during this transition isn't just the order, it's the absence of ambition. No power grabs, no whispered mutinies, no schemes bubbling beneath the surface. Why? Because Tommy Lucchese left no vacuum. He planned every step like he always had. 2 years before anyone else even noticed the sidewalk cracked. Even the FBI, who had been hounding him for decades, finally begin to understand they're witnessing the winding down of something rare. One agent writes in a memo, "Lucchese appears to be retreating from active command. No discernible disruption within the organization. Transfers appear pre-planned. Risk of instability? Negligible. Negligible." For a crime family with fingers in a dozen industries, ties to judges, and footprints in 3 states, that's legacy, that's control. As his health fades further, Tommy begins to shed the few visible signs of power. He stops wearing cufflinks, trades his monogrammed handkerchiefs for plain ones, starts walking without the ring that had once signaled his place in the hierarchy. A neighbor notices him sitting on his porch one evening, watching a thunderstorm. She waves. He waves back, then says, "That one's gonna pass through quick." And just like that, it does. By mid-1967, Lucchese is no longer seen in the city. Rumors circulate. Some say he's in Florida. Others claim he's being hidden in Sicily. The truth? He's in his own home, quiet, private, not hiding from the law, but from farewells. He never liked endings, too sentimental, too messy. Instead, he arranges one final meeting. Only 3 men attend. A simple room, no recording devices, no notes, no jackets required. He doesn't talk about death. He talks about systems. "Remember the schedules," he says. "Trucks run before sunup. Collections rotate on the 9th. And if a call doesn't get answered, assume the answer's no." That's it. No speeches, no drama, just instructions. When the meeting ends, one of the men hesitates at the door, asks softly, "You need anything, boss?" Tommy looks at the window, where the light is fading behind his rose bushes. "Yeah," he says, "a quieter summer." That summer, he slips from public life completely. And New York doesn't notice, because nothing stops. The unions stay calm. The docks don't jam. The deliveries arrive on time. The judges keep smiling. The envelopes keep moving. The silence isn't absence. It's design. And behind it all, in a modest home, with his shirts folded just so, and his slippers by the door, Tommy Lucchese sits quietly, listening to the rhythm of a machine that no longer needs its maker, because he built it that way. Late 1967 brings with it a kind of stillness around Tommy Lucchese's world. Not the kind of silence that follows collapse, but the quiet hum of something well-made, running without need for tuning. No headlines, no arrests, no wild stories. Just the machinery of a perfectly disciplined empire, functioning as if its founder had never stepped back. But inside that modest home in Long Island, the man who built it all is winding down. He still wakes early, but he doesn't dress right away. His suits remain in the closet, pressed, untouched. Most mornings, he sits by the window in a leather armchair his wife insists he replace. But he won't. It squeaks when he shifts, but not enough to matter. He reads the paper, sometimes out loud to himself, smiles at headlines that once might have set his day spinning. There's a story about a sanitation strike in Queens. Tommy chuckles and murmurs, "They should have asked me first." The calls come less frequently now, not because his people forget him, but because they respect the wall he's quietly put up. Lucchese's withdrawal has become part of the system itself. He's designed it to absorb his absence without a single stutter. Still, a few voices slip through. Carmine Tremonti visits once a week, never for more than an hour. They speak in whispers, surrounded by tomato plants and old lawn chairs. Carmine always brings a small gift, a newspaper from Sicily, a bottle of red, a lemon cake from a bakery on Arthur Avenue. "You're doing well," Tommy says one day, his voice thin but steady. "You keep the flow gentle, no splashing. It's the highest compliment Tommy gives." Tremonti nods, knowing better than to bask. On one visit, Carmine hesitates before leaving. You sure you don't want me to handle that thing in Midtown? Tommy just smiles. If I wanted it handled, it would have already stopped existing. That's the difference with Lucchese. Even now, with his strength waning, he chooses when and what to let go. He knows there's more power in restraint than in reaction, and his entire life has been a long experiment in how little noise one needs to make to shape a city. The FBI, meanwhile, is at a loss. Their surveillance of the Lucchese family shows nothing unusual. No succession wars, no spike in violence, no confusion over who's in charge. One frustrated memo reads, "Subject appears to have executed leadership transition with military-level discipline. Recommend reallocating resources." Translation, "We lost him before we ever got him." Back in his neighborhood, the mailman still delivers envelopes personally to the door. Not out of obligation, but because Tommy once paid for his daughter's braces when the union's dental plan came up short. The barber 2 blocks away keeps a chair open, just in case he drops by. He never does. But the chair waits, week after week, as if still expecting him. There's a story among neighbors that one day, a stranger came to the house asking for a donation to a local park project. Tommy invited him in. They spoke for 10 minutes. The man left with a check and a parting message. It's not charity. It's circulation. That's what Tommy believed. Everything flowed. Money, trust, loyalty, even silence. It all moved in cycles. If something stopped moving, it meant it had died. But there are moments, rare, fleeting, when the stillness carries weight. One evening, Lucchese sits with his wife in the backyard, the sun low, a radio humming with old Neapolitan songs. She knits. He watches the horizon. Then he says, almost to himself, "It's funny. I built an army out of tailors and truckers, and no one ever heard it march." She doesn't respond. She just pats his knee, and they sit in the music and the fading light. Inside, the house remains unchanged. The hallway still smells of lemon polish. The calendar is flipped one day too late, always. His desk drawer holds a list. Names, all first names, in his careful handwriting. No labels, just initials beside each one. Only Tommy knows what they mean. No one else is allowed to see. And then, quietly, one day, he doesn't come to the window. The paper sits on the stoop longer than usual. The espresso machine stays cold. Tramunti arrives not for a meeting, but for a goodbye. Tommy Lucchese dies in July of 1967. No drama, no explosions, no suspicious circumstances. Just a man in his bed, hands folded, eyes closed. The edges of the city still vibrating with his design. The funeral is an event both modest and monumental. No Godfather-style processions. No endless rows of limousines. But the men who do arrive, mayors, judges, businessmen, labor leaders, each nod in quiet recognition of a man who, in death, remains what he was in life. A ghost that walked like a man. They say the floral arrangement stretched 4 city blocks. That one of the cards simply read, "For the man who made everything work." No one claimed that card, but everyone knew who wrote it. And just like that, Tommy Lucchese passed. Not with noise, but with order. Not remembered for bloodshed, not for bravado, but for building a criminal dynasty with the calm, calculating hand of a man who preferred that everything, like him, remain just slightly out of sight. Even after his funeral, Tommy Lucchese lingers, not in ghost stories or whispered threats, but in systems, in every truck that rolls out of a warehouse on time, in every union meeting that ends with a handshake instead of a headline, in every envelope that passes smoothly from one hand to another without the need for a second glance. It's as if his fingerprints were left not on surfaces, but underneath them. The days following his death pass without incident. No violence, No sudden grabs for power. His capos don't jostle. His consigliere doesn't panic. There's a schedule after all, and Tommy wrote it. Carmine Tremonti, the heir apparent, doesn't throw a party or make a speech. He just moves into position like a man taking over his shift on the factory line. There are no arguments, no debates. Every lieutenant already knows what part of the machine they're responsible for. It's eerie, really. Law enforcement watches the Lucchese family more closely than ever, waiting for the fracture. But there isn't one. One FBI agent comments privately, "It's like the man rehearsed his own death 5 years early." And maybe he did. Many people still think Lucchese's power came from knowing people. But those who understand know the real truth. He understood structure. He understood how people break when you don't give them purpose. So he gave them purpose. Decades of it. Jobs, territories, routines, expectations. He wasn't just a leader. He was an engineer of loyalty. Meanwhile, the commission holds a quiet gathering. No public acknowledgement of his passing, but a subtle shift in how decisions are handled. Without Tommy in the room, things get just a touch louder. Debates stretch longer. Resolutions arrive with a little less grace. Even Gambino, who now stands as the most powerful figure in the underworld, adjusts his posture. He doesn't say it aloud, but he knows the balance has changed. Lucchese was the lever that steadied the scale. He wasn't the kind of man you replace. He was the kind of man who left blueprints. Back on the streets, business continues, but with occasional reminders of who built the foundation. A union leader retires and is replaced by someone trained under Lucchese's influence. A construction contract goes to a firm with silent connections to a flower shop that no longer takes appointments. A city inspector pauses before writing a citation and instead makes a call to an old friend, because Tommy's reach didn't die with him. It diffused into habits, routines, relationships. Do you remember the bakery near East 116th? The one that used to get robbed every year before Thanksgiving? For 10 years after Lucchese's death, no one touches it. Not because the owners are protected. No one even knows who owns it anymore. But everyone remembers that Tommy once liked their cannoli. And sometimes, remembrance is stronger than fear. Lucchese's files, if they ever existed, are never found. His office is cleared by his widow with quiet ceremony. One desk, a calendar, a cigar box with only clippings inside, jokes, recipes, old scores from Yankee games. Nothing that says criminal mastermind. Everything that says ordinary man with extraordinary order. But the stories persist. One tale, possibly apocryphal, says that in his final months, Lucchese gave a sealed envelope to a priest. Inside was a single sentence. Don't let them forget how easy it is to make things hard. Whether it's true or not, the lesson resonates, because that was Tommy's legacy, ease through control. While others built power through noise, he built power through quiet expectations. His crews didn't need reminders. His rivals didn't need warnings. His partners didn't need updates. They all just knew that kind of command isn't earned overnight. It takes decades. And when it works, it keeps working, even when the man is gone. Take, for example, the garment district, still running like a bloodstream into the early 70s. Fewer strikes, fewer disputes, the same families owning the same warehouses. All of it operating under principles Lucchese helped standardize. Even when new bosses rise, they inherit his systems. Some try to tweak them. Most give up. Because you don't improve a machine that's still running clean. That's the unspoken truth in mob history. Flashy bosses make headlines, but men like Lucchese make infrastructure. It's also why his name appears less in memoirs and court transcripts. He didn't leave trails. He left templates. You can see it in how his successors govern. Tramunti continues the legacy for a while, mimicking Tommy's rhythms, low-profile meetings, steady money, no fireworks. It works. For a time. But then the world changes. The 70s bring new pressures. RICO laws, wiretaps, snitches with memoir deals. The next generation of gangsters, more eager, less disciplined, don't always understand what Lucchese spent a lifetime perfecting. They want more, faster, louder, and in chasing that, they loosen the screws that Tommy kept tight for decades. Still, even amid that unraveling, pieces of his style remain. A trucking route no one touches, a diner where certain conversations still happen with lowered voices, a warehouse in Jersey that somehow always has just enough insurance to avoid inspection. They say ghosts haunt people. Tommy Lucchese haunts processes, and if you listen closely, in the soft click of a loading dock door, or the subtle nod between a union boss and a contractor, you might hear it. The gentle echo of a man who once said, "Don't build empires, build routines that outlive them." By the early 1970s, it becomes clear just how deeply Tommy Lucchese's fingerprints were pressed into the architecture of New York's underworld. Not just in the criminal enterprise, but in the very culture of how things moved, stalled, or conveniently disappeared. Even with new men wearing the crown, the rhythm of the streets still follows the beat he wrote. Carmine Tramunti, now officially boss, doesn't declare reforms a revolution. He doesn't need to. Lucchese left him a machine that hums, and Tramunti, steady, cautious, knows better than to tinker. His crew still calls it the schedule. Trucks still follow routes set years ago. Union payoffs still move on dates chosen by Tommy's quiet wisdom, and even the captains most skeptical of change admit it just works. The FBI, ever hopeful that Lucchese's death might loosen tongues or unravel the system, finds themselves frustrated. Again, wiretaps record nothing but routine. Surveillance captures only brief exchanges. One agent writes, "It's as if we're trying to investigate a calendar." That's the thing. Lucchese didn't just build structure. He built discipline. And discipline is contagious when it works. His legacy doesn't require loyalty. It requires momentum. Like a pendulum swinging, unbothered by who wound the clock. But while the inner workings remain intact, the world around it begins to shift. Television news crews grow bolder. Politicians campaign on cracking down harder. And younger mobsters, greedy, restless, start questioning why the game isn't faster. Why they can't expand rackets, or show off, or just do it like the movies. To them, Lucchese is a legend, but a slow one. They don't understand that slow is what kept him standing for decades. Still, not all forget. Old-timers at corner cafes sip espresso and recall stories with reverence. There was a time, one says, you could walk down Mulberry Street and know who owned what. Not because it was written down, because the deliveries ran like mass at St. Anthony's. Always on time. No questions. Tommy made it feel natural. Even his enemies admit it. One former Genovese associate, now long retired and living in Miami, once remarked, "We never feared Lucchese. We just didn't want to disappoint him. And that's rare. Fear gets things done. Respect makes it last." It's during this stretch of time, between 1968 and 1972, that the Lucchese family's influence over labor solidifies into something almost institutional. In the meatpacking district, truck schedules are still negotiated using forms drafted in Tommy's heyday. At LaGuardia, freight containers still get processed through terminals with silent nods to deals made in the back of diners decades prior. And then there's the judges. While most mobsters avoided the courtroom like the plague, Tommy had always approached the legal system with polite indifference. He didn't fear judges. He studied them, knew their habits, their kids' schools, their favorite charities. It's said that in 1970, when a young prosecutor tried to pull tax records from a Lucchese-linked sanitation company, 3 different legal challenges landed on his desk, each from a different jurisdiction, all referencing obscure regulations passed in the 50s. Each of those regulations, whispered into being by men who once had dinner near Lucchese's table. That's not corruption, that's planning, and it lives on. But even the best structures start to show cracks when the climate shifts. The federal government begins deploying the RICO Act in earnest. Surveillance becomes more advanced, and informants, once unthinkable in Lucchese's empire, start crawling out of the corners. It's not a collapse, not yet, but it's friction. And Tommy hated friction. One moment that marks the turning of the tide is the arrest of Carmine Tramunti in 1973. The charge, narcotics trafficking. Now, whether or not Tramunti truly knew about every detail of the French connection, heroin ring is still debated. Many people still think he was just too careful to be that reckless. Others argue the times had changed. Young earners going rogue, or perhaps greed finally breaking through discipline. But one thing is certain, Tommy would have never let it get that close to the flame. The arrest doesn't destroy the family, but it dents the rhythm. And once rhythm is disturbed, recovery becomes harder. That's when some start looking back, not to just honor Lucchese, but to ask, what would Tommy have done? In certain circles, his name begins to take on an almost Talmudic quality. Lucchese wouldn't have allowed that. Lucchese would have moved him out months ago. Lucchese would have shut it down before the press even smelled it. And these aren't exaggerations. They're sincere efforts to remember how to manage things, because management was Lucchese's genius. Not intimidation, not brutality, but the simple art of making people depend on you without realizing it. It wasn't just about trucks and routes and unions. It was about designing gravity. Even beyond New York, his model starts to influence others. In Chicago, certain crews begin copying his approach, spreading influence through delivery routes, not blood. In Miami, a sanitation racket mimics Lucchese's method of embedding clean books beneath dirty routes. He becomes a blueprint, not just a memory, and yet his absence is still felt. A new capo mismanages a dock worker deal in Staten Island. A payout is late for the first time in 25 years. A sit-down drags on longer than needed because no one's quite sure how to resolve it. Without Tommy's glance from the head of the table, the system still runs, but now it remembers him out loud. There's a man, once a minor bookmaker, who retires in 74 and writes a quiet memoir, never published. In one passage, he recalls being summoned to Tommy's office after accidentally overcharging a client tied to a city contract. I thought I was finished, the man writes, but he just looked at me and said, "That's not how we do math. Make it right, and then make yourself better at arithmetic." That line stays with the man for decades. Not the threat, not the warning, the instruction, because that was Lucchese's style. Correct quietly, reinforce silently, and move forward like nothing ever broke. Even in death, he's still correcting things. And so, the 1970s roll on. Messier, louder. But somewhere beneath the chaos, if you peel back the layers, the signs of Lucchese remain. In contracts, in habits, in men who still fold their shirts a certain way and return calls at exactly 9:01 a.m. And in the city itself, a city that still, unknowingly, moves along tracks he helped lay. By the time the late 1970s drift into view, the world Tommy Lucchese once calibrated with such quiet precision is beginning to fray around the edges. Not collapse, not crumble, but rattle. Like a chandelier with one loose chain, still hanging, still shimmering, but with a soft warning hum that only the observant can hear. The city has changed. Skylines are taller. Crime is louder. The streets that once ran on whispers now pulse with bravado. The new generation of mobsters, born into the safety of systems they didn't design, start believing that tradition means immortality. They forget what Lucchese built, and more dangerously, why he built it that way. Some capos begin cutting corners, faster scores, flashier gifts. They buy Cadillacs that park sideways and open restaurants with names in gold leaf. They make noise. And noise, as Lucchese always knew, attracts flies, and eventually, federal agents. Still, the ghost of Tommy lingers in corners. His rules, now passed around like folklore, keep certain wheels spinning. Trucking in the outer boroughs still runs on his schedule. Garment deliveries to boutique chains downtown, same packaging code. Even a handful of warehouses in Newark still file their inventory logs using color-coded clipboards Lucchese's crew introduced in '62. But without Tommy's presence, the compliance becomes nostalgic instead of functional. There's a moment in 1977 when a young upstart within the family suggests scrapping the old Monday collections rhythm in favor of digital coordination, an early crude attempt to modernize. The idea gets traction until one of the elder lieutenants who once sat in Lucchese's living room says quietly, "You want to rewrite Tommy's clock, you better learn how to build one first." The room goes silent. The plan dies. That's the thing. Lucchese's authority wasn't just in systems. It was in memory. And memory, while powerful, has its limits. By 1978, the Lucchese family is still operational, still respected. But cracks begin to form beneath the surface. Cases pile up. Wiretaps become more sophisticated. Informants, once rare and reviled, become pawns in an increasingly desperate game. Even the FBI begins to shift its approach. A 1979 internal memo reads, "Lucchese's structure appears to have slowed down the onset of organizational decay. But in his absence, we are now seeing predictable fractures. Loyalty drops, discipline erodes, decision-making slows." Predictable, because Tommy had predicted it. He once said in a rare private comment, "A system is like a coat. It fits the man who wears it. But if the next guy's built different, he'll either ruin the coat or himself." Still, there are bright spots. One small team, led by a capo named Benny Salvo, trained personally by one of Lucchese's last capos, continues operating like it's 1965. Quiet crews, clean books, no press. They run trash disposal across 2 boroughs and a half-dozen precincts, and no one even notices. When a new associate asks Benny how they stay untouched, he just says, "We still use his map, Lucchese's map. Not on paper, not in photos, but in muscle memory." That's what separates Tommy's legacy from others. While bosses like Gotti turned their lives into neon billboards, Lucchese turned his into a series of well-worn steps, easy to follow if you know the rhythm. Even outside the mob world, his structure finds its way into odd corners. An old union lawyer, long retired, gives a lecture at a law school in 1980 and surprises his audience by talking about Lucchese, not as a criminal, but as a case study in systematized influence. "He treated labor like architecture," the lawyer says. "You build strong foundations, evenly spaced supports, and you never add more weight than the frame can carry." The students, mostly unaware of Lucchese's legacy, write it down. Some will quote it in future careers, never realizing the man they're quoting wore handmade shoes and never once signed his own name to a contract he couldn't walk away from. Even the city itself seems to echo his restraint. Do you remember the sanitation slowdown in 1981? It wasn't Tommy's men anymore, of course, but someone quietly picked up the phone, adjusted a few schedules, and within days, the trucks rolled again. No announcements, no threats, just gravity, Tommy's kind. But time, as always, is a patient eraser. By the mid-1980s, most of the men who truly knew Lucchese are gone, retired, dead, flipped, or forgotten. His name comes up less. Young earners think it's just the label on the organization. Lucchese, they say, as if it's a brand, not a man, not a method. They wear flashier suits. They talk louder. They negotiate with television producers. And slowly, inevitably, the gears begin to slip. Lucchese's systems were designed to outlast him, but they were never designed to outlast arrogance, because arrogance is what Tommy fought his whole life, not with violence, but with patience, with subtlety, with the quiet knowledge that the loudest man in the room is often the most fragile. And that's what starts to fade as the years tick forward. His final great insight, passed down only in murmurs, is this: control isn't in what you touch. It's in what you don't have to. In his absence, more and more men try to touch everything. Control becomes obsession. Obsession becomes exposure. Exposure becomes courtrooms, headlines, betrayals. But there are still those who remember. The old bookie who never moved his office out of the Bronx. The tailor whose ledgers still run on Monday pickups and Thursday drop-offs. The diner that still holds a booth for no one in particular, just in case the quiet man with the gentle smile comes back. And on certain quiet nights, when the city finally dims, and the streets sound more like they did in the 50s, you might catch a cabbie humming a tune, unaware that the route he takes, the route that avoids traffic, construction, and police traps, was once charted by a man who never needed to raise his voice, a man named Tommy Lucchese. And though his name fades from headlines, though statues were never carved, and no memoir ever published, he remains in schedules, in balance, in the soft whisper of order that still moves beneath the chaos. The 80s roll in hard, louder, faster, more wired. Neon flickers over every block. Wall Street is high on itself. And New York, now tangled in Reagan-era ambition and headline-chasing justice, becomes the kind of place Tommy Lucchese would have loathed. There's no patience left, no grace, and definitely no quiet. The Mafia, too, shifts with the tempo. No longer satisfied with backroom deals and silent paydays, younger bosses crave legacy by spotlight. Trials become media events. Indictments read like scripts. And in this new world, discretion is no longer currency. It's antique. But even in the middle of the din, pieces of Tommy's blueprint still pulse under the pavement. The Lucchese family, though no longer steered by the hand that drafted its rhythm, remains notably less chaotic than its rivals. Gambino's gone volatile, Bonanno's cracked into factions, Colombo's spinning in lawsuits, but Lucchese's family, while frayed at the edges, still makes its pickups. Still avoids the front page more often than not. That's because of one thing: legacy muscle memory. The older capos, trained in the Lucchese method, keep their crews steady. They don't expand too fast. They don't fix what isn't broken. And they sure as hell don't speak to reporters. One capo, when asked why he avoids restaurants where the bosses hang out, replies, "Because Tommy never liked dessert served with subpoenas." That sums it up. Lucchese's era had an unwritten rule book. Every page read, "Get it done, quietly." Now, noise is the product. The FBI, growing fat on new surveillance toys and eager prosecutors, focuses attention on wiretaps, bugged cars, flipped drivers. They make arrests. They win cases. But with Lucchese's family, it always takes longer, always requires digging deeper, because there's less to find. Not nothing, just less. That's what makes Tommy's fingerprints different. He didn't erase them. He embedded them into wood grain. His arrangements weren't just clever, they were natural, which makes them harder to detect, harder to uproot. One federal investigator admits privately in 1986, it's like chasing footprints in cement that dried 30 years ago. And then there's the union muscle, still intact, still cooperative. The garment district has shrunk, of course, factories moving south or overseas, but what's left is still steady. Some of the same trucking routes Tommy mapped in the 40s are now managed by men who weren't even born when he died, but who still refer to the Wednesday schedule as Lucchese's Loop. That phrase sticks, Lucchese's Loop. It becomes mob folklore, referenced in passing by wise guys too young to remember the man, but smart enough to know his system worked. When crews run into trouble, busted invoices, a stalled delivery, a missing envelope, they ask, is it inside the loop? If it is, odds are it'll get fixed. Because Tommy's loop wasn't just about logistics, it was about predictability as protection, but the culture around it begins to corrode. By the late 80s, new blood sees tradition as weight. They want tech. They want fast money, not slow tribute. Bookmaking apps, offshore laundering, more cash, less etiquette. Some try to revise the systems, reorganize, cut costs, and it backfires immediately. One young capo, trying to streamline payouts, decides to switch envelope delivery from cash to wire transfers. More modern, he says. More efficient. 2 weeks later, 3 pickups fail. One bank flags the deposits. A courier gets cold feet. An entire district goes unpaid. The elders shake their heads. Tommy never trusted banks, one mutters. He trusted clocks. That's it, clocks. Lucchese didn't believe in trust. He believed in time-tested behavior, and when someone deviated from that, the machine hiccuped. In 1989, a small trial begins. Another Ryko case. The prosecutors line up witnesses, flip a bookkeeper, tie threads from a freight company to an offshore account. But they can't tie any of it back to Lucchese's core, because even though the family's still operating, its spine, what Lucchese built, is still largely intact. In one of the trial's quieter moments, a witness mentions an old accounting practice, payments made with coded slips of carbon paper, matched to invoice dates instead of names. We called it Tommy's Shuffle, he says, grinning nervously. That moment doesn't make the papers, but every man in the courtroom hears it. Tommy's Shuffle, just another layer of systems designed to function like air. Always present, always needed, rarely questioned. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, the real world turns. Manhattan builds up. Skylines glass over. Mob money slowly trickles into construction again, through concrete pours and scaffolding rentals. Lucchese's model, low visibility, high control, gets borrowed, then blurred. Some crews copy it, others dilute it, but none replace it, and yet traces remain. A small freight company in Queens, incorporated in 1963, still files its route maps by hand. Tuesday pickups, Thursday drops, no direct deposits. Ask the manager why, and he shrugs, because that's the way Mr. L liked it. Mr. L, no full name, no brass plaque, just the ghost of consistency. Do you remember the tailor shop in Midtown that always closed at 3:45 p.m., no matter what? No one knew why. The current owner inherited it from his uncle. All he knows is that on Thursdays, a man once came in to sit. Didn't buy anything, just read the paper, asked about deliveries, never raised his voice. The man's name, long forgotten, but the chair remains. It's little moments like that, untraceable, unrecorded, that mark Lucchese's true legacy. Because Tommy didn't just shape a crime family, he shaped expectation, how things move, who says yes, when no means maybe. And even as the next generation forgets the details, The structure stands, like scaffolding around a building no one realizes was designed by a man who preferred silence over cement. And if by chance you're walking through a quiet block of the Bronx, or Queens, or an alley in Brooklyn where a truck idles at 6:01 a.m. every Friday, know this: it's not luck, it's not coincidence, it's the loop, still running, still obeying, still whispering his name. The 1990s bring a new kind of storm to organized crime, a cold, clinical kind. Gone are the days of smoke-filled backrooms and handshake diplomacy. In their place, RICO indictments, federal task forces, courtrooms wired for sound, and prosecutors with book deals already in draft. The mob is no longer a shadow, it's a target. And the world Tommy Lucchese once sculpted out of silence and structure begins to flicker under the harsh fluorescent lights of subpoenas and sealed exhibits. But some things, strangely, still hold. The Lucchese family, while battered like the rest, retains something resembling cohesion. While other families splinter, flip, and fragment into headlines, Lucchese's crew still functions. Slower, thinner, more cautious, sure, but not broken. The spine remains, and that spine, it was set decades ago by Tommy. Investigators working through wiretap evidence in 1992 begin noticing something curious. Conversations in other families are peppered with chaos. Who's mad? Who's disloyal? Who's about to flip? But in the Lucchese family tapes, there's still a rhythm. Still an order to the madness. Even in panic, they're quoting procedure. "You didn't clear it on the Monday book," one capo says in a low voice. "I called Benny at 4:30 like Tommy used to," another insists. It's like listening to men argue over scripture. Only the religion is routine. Lucchese's influence has become generational. One capo, the son of a man who once ran numbers for Tommy himself, tells his own recruits in 1993, "You want to live past 50? Then you do 3 things. Show up on time, speak once, and never change the system unless it stops paying." That's Lucchese's law, distilled and passed down like family silver. Even law enforcement begins adapting, not just chasing crimes, but studying design. They start mapping connections not by names, but by timelines, routes, payroll rhythms, meeting patterns, and time after time, when they untangle a racket or a scheme, the pattern reflects something pre-existing, something too stable to be the invention of the moment. One assistant U.S. attorney in 1995 summarizes it best. "It's like trying to shut down a train schedule that hasn't had a conductor in 30 years, but it still runs." And still, the Lucchese family endures, not untouched, not invincible, but intact in a way that defies explanation in an era of plea deals and turncoats. Part of that survival comes from restraint. Lucchese's successors, at least the wise ones, remember his lessons. Keep your crews small. Keep your books clean, or don't keep them at all. Never give an order you need to repeat. And never, ever make a man feel replaceable unless you're willing to bury him. That balance, fear without fire, loyalty without lies, is what kept the engine running even as the tracks shifted. Do you remember the Queen's Warehouse bust of 1997? Agents expected chaos, flushed drugs, shredded ledgers, frantic runners. Instead, they found a tidy ledger book, shipping manifests with dates going back to 1961. One crate, still sealed, had Lucchese's initials pressed into wax on the corner. Nothing illegal was inside, just old linens misrouted once and left forgotten. One agent stared at the seal for a long time before saying, "This isn't a warehouse, it's a time capsule." They didn't charge anyone, and yet something in that room reminded everyone present. Lucchese didn't run an empire. He ran a routine with borders, but time is unkind to legacy. The turn of the millennium introduces new challenges that Tommy could have predicted, but never prepared for. Digital trails, phone pings, algorithmic surveillance, and worse, ambition without patience. A new breed of mobster emerges, eager, erratic, obsessed with flash. They want fast envelopes, big deals, social influence. They don't respect the loop. They ignore the rhythms. They make the kind of noise Lucchese spent a lifetime muffling. The old-timers call them the fast burns, and they're right. Within a few years, several crews spin out. Indictments rise. Some rackets vanish, not from police action, but mismanagement. Overpromised. Underdelivered. Deals made without clearance. Meetings booked with men who once would have been vetted for a month before a handshake. But not all is lost, because there are still corners of the Lucchese legacy that remain untouched. In Staten Island, an unremarkable moving company still processes its payroll in cash. The foreman, an old Sicilian named Sal, keeps 3 sets of books, one for taxes, one for the crew, and one written entirely in shorthand symbols only he understands. Asked once why he runs things that way, he simply replies, Tommy liked layers. In the Bronx, a small but steady food distribution line still adheres to a delivery route plotted in 1958. The driver, 63 and nearing retirement, says the route has never needed changing. It works. Why fix what works? That's the question that haunts the men now chasing Lucchese's ghost. Why did it work so well? Why does it still work? And maybe the answer is this: because Tommy never built an empire. He built permission. He gave men the permission to believe that order was not just possible, but profitable. That you could run things smoothly without screaming. That you could build legacy without names on doors. That power didn't need an audience. Even today, long after his photo has vanished from desks and his name from lips, you can feel him, where things still function without friction. A warehouse that never gets robbed. A shipment that always arrives early. A meeting that ends before it was supposed to start, with no one upset and everyone paid. That's not luck. That's design, and it whispers the same thing, decade after decade. Lucchese was here, and he planned this. By the dawn of the 2000s, New York feels like a different city altogether. The skyline has changed. The streets are faster, tighter, more digital. Gentrification replaces grit. The underworld, once ruled by murmurs and routines, now faces algorithms and surveillance satellites. Everything is louder. Everything is tracked. And yet, if you know where to listen, Tommy Lucchese's presence still hums beneath the surface, like a bass line too steady to fade. There's a warehouse on the edge of Brooklyn, half abandoned, half active. It used to process linens. Now it stores lighting equipment. But once a month, a quiet man with a ledger, not a tablet, walks the perimeter with a clipboard and marks the locks with a chalk stick. He says little, smiles rarely, but every item is exactly where it's supposed to be. Ask him why he still does inventory that way in the age of scanners and barcodes, and he'll shrug. The man before me worked for someone important. We don't change it if it's not broken. He doesn't mention Lucchese, doesn't need to. The system, still moving. Elsewhere, the Lucchese family, still bearing Tommy's name, is weathering storms. Indictments rise. New capos surface and vanish. Cases drag on. Cooperation becomes common. Informants fill the pages of court transcripts with details that would have made old-timers bury their faces in their hands. But even amid this fragmentation, something unexpected occurs. A return to structure. Younger mobsters, jaded by the chaos of unchecked greed and blown operations, start looking backward. They begin asking about how it was when things worked. They want to know how envelopes moved before there were apps, how disputes were solved without blood, how crews stayed quiet and profitable. And the name that surfaces again and again? Lucchese. Not as a saint, not as a savior, as a standard. Some families begin holding closed-door meetings not to plan hits or hustle new rackets, but to restore order. They dig up old protocols, resurrect Lucchese's tempo, weekly check-ins, no cross-crew freelancing, all money accounted for on Fridays, all decisions made on Mondays. It's not nostalgia, it's necessity. Because chaos, it turns out, isn't profitable. One young soldier caught in a wiretap in 2003 can be heard saying, "We gotta run it like Tommy did. Clean books, clean boots." His capo chuckles. Tommy's dead, but then adds, "But yeah, maybe you're right." Even federal agents begin to acknowledge that Lucchese's model, though criminal, was oddly responsible. One retired agent, interviewed for a documentary, says, "I didn't respect what he did, but I respected how he did it. He didn't just break laws, he built systems." Systems. That's what always comes back. Not violence, not infamy, systems. Do you remember the old cafe on Arthur Avenue that used to host afternoon card games for old bookies and ex-longshoremen? It shut down in 2006. Before the doors closed, the owner left a letter in the window. It read, "To the gentleman who played here and always kept it clean. The game is over, but the rules were beautiful. Thank you. Vito." They say Vito's father once served espresso to Tommy Lucchese. Not a word needed, just a nod, and a schedule that never missed. Even now, in the digital age, some parts of Tommy's world remain untouched by modern chaos. One private garbage route in the Bronx still operates using Lucchese-era invoice codes, manually typed. The drivers? Sons and nephews of men who once picked up restaurant bins under his watch, and they still say things like, "We don't skip Thursdays. Tommy hated a skipped Thursday." The line gets a laugh, but the route never skips, because under the smog and scroll of the modern city, beneath the glass towers and 5G signals, there are still rituals, unseen, uncelebrated, quietly unbreakable. And most of them trace back to a man with soft shoes, a steady watch, and a voice that never needed to shout. You know what's strange? Even the mob historians, the ones with timelines and mugshots who've diagrammed every boss from Maranzano to Gotti, tend to pause when they reach Lucchese. They call him the shadow strategist, the invisible dawn. They note how few headlines carry his name, how few bullets had to be fired to sustain one of the most enduring crime families in American history. They wonder, aloud, how that kind of discipline could survive in an ecosystem built on ego. And some still debate how much Lucchese really knew. Did he personally authorize every move? Every deal? Every drop of influence into political veins? Or had he built something even more powerful? A system that could think for itself? Because that's the thing about perfect design. When it works, no one notices. The world remembers those who make noise. But it functions on the work of those who don't. And Lucchese? He didn't make noise. He made things move. So next time you walk past a warehouse whose lights flick on at exactly 5:55 a.m., or a city truck that idles in place for 5 minutes longer than necessary, or an envelope passed quietly across a diner table before the second cup of coffee, ask yourself, was that chance? Or was that just Tommy still working? By the second decade of the 21st century, Tommy Lucchese has been dead for over 40 years. And yet, his name still moves in whispers, in courtrooms, in coffee shops, in construction site trailers, where old habits outlast technology. He is not remembered with the glamour of Capone, nor the tabloid tragedy of Gotti. His fame is not cinematic. It's functional, because Tommy didn't craft stories. He crafted systems. And systems, when built well, tend to keep breathing even when their architect is dust. In 2012, an internal union audit flagged a payroll discrepancy in a sanitation contract serving 3 boroughs. Nothing criminal, just a strange consistency. Payments came early. Crews rotated exactly every 8 weeks. Even when vendors changed, the same trucks kept arriving. A consultant reviewing the pattern raised an eyebrow. "This doesn't look like corruption," she said. "It looks like planning." That's the ghost again. Lucchese's kind of ghost, not haunting people, haunting processes. And while his family, the organization that bears his name, has changed, shrunk, and in many ways become a pale echo of its 1950s might, there are still corners of the city where Lucchese's legacy remains operational, not because anyone enforces it, but because no one's figured out how to do it better. One such place is a warehouse complex on the edge of Queens, tucked between a bakery supply company and a used auto parts distributor. It's quiet, clean, no security cameras, no guards, just a single office with a man in his 60s, known only as Gino. Every Monday morning, envelopes are laid out. They're picked up by men who never speak. The sign-in sheet is handwritten, the handwriting identical for each entry. When asked once why the system isn't digitalized, Gino chuckled. "Because Tommy said if it ain't broke, don't let it near a keyboard." Gino never met Lucchese. His father did. That's how memory works in this world. It doesn't need archives. It just needs routine. Elsewhere in the city, a young real estate developer pushing to renovate a lot in the Bronx finds his permits stalled. Not rejected, not denied, just paused. When he finally meets a city liaison for coffee, he's told to talk to a guy who handles the trucks. Confused, he follows the trail until it leads to a minor sanitation subcontractor, one whose founder once did weekly pickups on a Lucchese-controlled route. He's told, gently, that if he wants progress, he might consider using a different cement supplier, one that dates back to the 1940s, one that still keeps 2 sets of books. One for the city, one for the schedule. Tommy's schedule, that's the thing. While others sought control through noise and fire, Tommy built a system that hides in plain sight. A system that becomes expected. Even the NYPD in off-the-record conversations admit it. "I don't know how he did it," one detective says in a 2015 podcast that would later be scrubbed of names. But there are things, old things, still moving because of what he put in place. He built traffic patterns that weren't for cars. They were for power. Meanwhile, in the underworld itself, Lucchese's name becomes mythic again. Not because of recent events, but because so few bosses today can replicate his model. Young earners treat the name like scripture. They trade lines like, "Tommy never needed to raise his voice. Tommy paid you on time or not at all. Tommy didn't need guards. He had schedules." One young capo, caught on a wiretap, argues with his crew about expanding too quickly. He says, "You think this is a race? Lucchese ran for 50 years without breaking a sweat." The FBI agent listening marks the quote, underlines it, and writes in the margin, "Still the gold standard." That same year, a professor at NYU publishes a paper on informal systems of order in American criminal economies. One entire chapter is dedicated to Lucchese, not for his crimes, but for his predictability. The thesis? That order, not violence, was the most profitable export of organized crime in the mid-20th century, and that Lucchese, above all others, was its quiet architect. Many people still think the Mafia thrived on fear, but Tommy showed something else, that you can run an empire if your people trust the clock more than the gun. And what about the man himself? No statue stands in his honor. No plaque. No museum exhibits. Just memories. A dry cleaner in Brooklyn still folds his invoices the same way. "The man upstairs told his father." A family in Long Island still plants tomato vines each spring in rows spaced exactly 18 inches apart, because Tommy said they'd breathe better that way. An old Catholic church downtown receives donations every December in cash-stuffed envelopes. No note. Just the word circulation written inside. No one questions it. They just file it under the way things are. And so, in the quiet, steady workings of things that still function when everything else is frantic, Lucchese remains. He's not a headline. He's a harmony, the hum beneath the surface, the silence that still keeps people showing up on time, balancing their books, returning favors exactly as received. You may not see him, but somewhere between the folding of an envelope and the arrival of a truck 4 minutes ahead of schedule, he's there, still working, still whispering. We don't do chaos here. By the time the 2020s arrive, New York has all but forgotten most of its ghosts. The sidewalks are wider, the bodegas brighter, and the city's rhythms are powered more by delivery apps than delivery trucks. But here and there, like seams in a well-worn coat, you can still trace the outline of Tommy Lucchese's world. It's not loud, it's not visible, but it's present in quiet pockets of Queens, in the way a butcher shop opens at 5:57 a.m. every Tuesday, in the precise rotation of security shifts at a warehouse near Hunts Point, in the schedule of waste pickups that never run on weekends, never skip a Monday, and never require reminders. Some of the men now running these routes were born after Tommy died. They've never seen a photo, never heard his voice, but they move like they've been trained by him. And maybe in a way they have, because the systems he built didn't need his presence. They only needed repetition. He didn't create loyalty to himself. He created loyalty to consistency. That's far harder to dismantle. It's what most empires miss. Tommy understood that men change, fortunes shift, and power erodes. But a good routine outlives them all. Still, the Lucchese family, in name and operation, has changed. Modern indictments have slimmed the crew count. The press no longer trembles at the word mob. Wiretaps sound more like business calls than threats. And yet, beneath all that modernization, the core still runs on his tempo. In 2021, an investigative reporter tries to map out the surviving bones of the 5 families. Most charts look like medical diagrams, fractured limbs, torn tendons, but Lucchese's lineage still shows a spine. Bent, yes. Scarred, but never broken. The article notes, Lucchese's family is the only one whose structure suggests a prior architectural hand. Someone who built for endurance, not for flair. Tommy would have smirked at that. He always preferred blueprints to battle plans. You remember that old diner in the Bronx, the one with the creaky booths and a jukebox that only plays Sinatra on Tuesdays? It still serves a lunch special called the Tailor's Plate. No one really knows why. It's just been on the menu since 1969. Ham, provolone, pickled peppers, clean, quiet. Some say it was Tommy's favorite, others say it wasn't, but the plate never leaves the menu. Why? Because someone once asked it to stay. And in Tommy's world, if something works and doesn't cause trouble, it stays. Even today, when surveillance comes by satellite and orders are encrypted, there are young earners who return to the old ways. They keep hard copies. They walk their own pickups. They learn the names of the janitors and the night shift guards, not out of nostalgia, out of instinct, because Lucchese's system taught a deeper rule. People matter, but schedules run them. One young capo tells his crew in 2023, "You don't impress me by being loud. You impress me by being where you said you'd be, on time, with everything balanced." Another laughs and calls it Tommy talk, but the crew listens, because somewhere between the noise of modern crime and the chaos of ambition, they know something's been lost, the rhythm of reason. Lucchese had it, he lived by it, and more than that, he left it behind. That's rare. Most bosses leave wreckage. Tommy left maps, and those maps, whether in the timing of a payroll drop or the angle of a delivery van's route still work. There's even a story, unverified but repeated in low tones, that a city department once tried to optimize waste management routes using AI. After 3 months of testing, the AI spat out a schedule almost identical to one drafted in 1956 by Tommy's logistics guy. The report was shelved because you don't argue with results, even if they wear a dead man's shoes. Many people still think the mob's power was in violence, but the real power was efficiency. Lucchese never boasted, never posed. He didn't want to be feared. He wanted to be obeyed because the alternative was dumber. He proved, quietly, that you could build a dynasty not on force, but on function. And when he died, he didn't leave behind chaos. He left behind clockwork. Even now, on quiet streets, when a truck glides into place 3 minutes before expected, when a handoff happens under a blinking sign, time to the second, when an envelope arrives sealed, stacked, and complete, without a name on it, that's not coincidence. That's not luck. That's residual design. It's Tommy Lucchese, still present, still relevant, still, without raising his voice, reminding the city how to move. He didn't just build a mafia, he built a metronome. And though the men have changed, the buildings have shifted, and the streets now hum with a different kind of traffic, his timing remains quiet, consistent, unflinching. You won't see his face on murals, but his fingerprints still pressed into every smooth operation that no one notices. And that was always his goal. Because if they notice, you did it wrong. In the criminal underworld, they say the worst fate isn't prison or death, it's irrelevance. And yet, Tommy Lucchese remains the rare anomaly. A man long dead, long silent, and yet still consulted in absence. How? Because the rules he wrote, unspoken and unwritten, are still being obeyed, not out of fear, but out of results. There's a small cafe in East Harlem where 3 men meet every other Wednesday. They don't carry weapons. They dress plainly. Their conversation, to an outsider, is about deliveries and weather and children in school. But underneath the mundane, every sentence is coded. Every meeting scheduled around a rhythm that predates smartphones. They call this meeting the Thursday call. It's held on a Wednesday. The name is part tradition, part test. If you don't know why it's called that, you don't belong at the table. Why Thursday? Because Lucchese preferred Thursday to initiate new moves. It gave him Friday to tighten, Saturday to adjust, and Sunday to disappear. A built-in safety net, baked into the week. The schedule was the shield, and it still is. These men, none older than 45, were taught not by Tommy, but by those who were taught by him. That's how legacies stretch, not in banners, but in behavioral echoes. Even when indictments strike, as they inevitably do, the core system survives. The names change, the faces vanish, but somewhere, a note gets handed off without a word. A truck route pivots to avoid risk. A crew holds off on a deal not because someone said no, but because the tempo feels off. Intuition? Sure. But also residual pattern memory. Do you remember the tale of the red folder? It's almost legend now. An old Lucchese captain, one of the last to know Tommy personally, was rumored to carry a worn red folder wherever he went. Inside, not plans, not names, not cash, just procedures. How to settle disputes between crews, how to handle late payments without escalation, which priests could be trusted with whispered confessions. When the old man died in the early 2000s, the folder vanished. Some say it was burned, others say it was split into pieces and handed out. One protocol per man. What's known as this. Several modern Lucchese crews began moving with sudden coordination shortly after his death, as if guided, as if the folder hadn't disappeared, only dispersed. It's eerie in a way, Most organizations struggle to survive even a single generation, but the Lucchese family, built under Tommy's quiet stewardship, has now weathered nearly a century of surveillance, betrayal, technological shifts, and societal upheaval, and still functions. Reduced? Yes. Invisible? Often. But broken? Never quite, because it was never just about profit. It was about discipline. Tommy once told an associate, so the story goes, "I'd rather lose $1 on time than earn 10 in a scramble." And that philosophy, still evident. In 2024, a state contractor reviewing transportation bids noticed one outfit underbid everyone by 7%, yet still hit every benchmark early. When pressed on their methods, the rep replied, "We don't bid for margins, we bid for longevity." The company had no online presence. Its billing office used a fax machine. Its manager? The grandson of a man who once stitched suits for Lucchese lieutenants. Patterns again, routines again, and Tommy, still again, in the margins. Many people still think Lucchese was lesser because he wasn't theatrical, that he lacked the charisma of flamboyant dons, that his power was smaller because it wasn't shouted. But what they fail to grasp is that longevity doesn't bloom in chaos. It requires quiet. Even his funeral in 1967 echoed that ethos. No gun salute, no circus, just suits, whispers, flowers wrapped in modest white ribbon. A few nods, no tears, and yet, to this day, his grave is visited every November by men who never met him. They leave no flowers, just folded napkins or pieces of paper with clock symbols sketched in the corner. Time. Always time, because Lucchese's legacy is not one of drama or myth. It's one of durability. Ask any modern capo what they want most, and they'll say it. Something that lasts. That's what Tommy left, and in that, he might be the rarest don of them all. Not just a builder of schemes, but a builder of structure that doesn't collapse. The final irony? His most dangerous weapon was never fear. It was the expectation of reliability. It turned enemies cautious, made allies loyal, and gave him the most powerful thing any man in that world could ask for, time itself as a partner. So when the city moves quietly, when the trucks arrive early, when the system works without spotlight, it's not a miracle. It's the echo of a tailor, a designer of systems, a man who never needed to speak loudly because he'd already sewn the outcome into the seams of the operation. And it's still holding. They say the deepest legacies don't sit in museums. They breathe in the unnoticed. That's where Tommy Lucchese's fingerprints remain, not carved into plaques, but etched into the cadence of a city that still, somehow, moves to a rhythm he helped compose. Let's take a walk down Mulberry Street. Not the one tourists pose on with cannoli and selfies, but the early morning one, when the street still smells like bread and oil, and metal gates creak open like old joints. There's a produce vendor, Frankie, third generation, who arranges his crates by color, not by fruit. His grandfather used to do the same. Why? Tommy said it looked cleaner. He shrugs. People buy cleaner. Tommy never sold peaches, but he sold order, and people still buy that. Elsewhere, inside a dimly lit private club in Bensonhurst, the backgammon board hasn't changed in 30 years. Same chips, same table, same 8 p.m. game every Thursday. The men playing it? A revolving door of faces, but the rules haven't wavered. No bets over $200. Loser buys dinner. No phones. The new guy, fresh out of law school, once asked why. One of the old-timers said, "Because Tommy didn't like distractions when the board was out." Again, Tommy never played here, but his preferences float, carried by memory, repeated by those who never forgot. You see, Lucchese never wanted to be remembered in headlines. He wanted to be remembered in habits. That's why he didn't chase publicity, didn't let photographers linger, didn't flash gold or silk. He let his crews do the talking, and his system do the proving. And what's more powerful than a system that outlives its creator? Because here's the twist most don't expect. Lucchese's influence doesn't feel criminal anymore. It feels practical. It's embedded in how corner stores handle deliveries, how some landlords keep handwritten ledgers even today, how a small fleet of street sweepers in Staten Island follows an undocumented pattern that hasn't missed a beat since 1973. The city moved on from Tommy, but it did so using the rails he laid down. Even those outside his world came to respect the quiet efficacy. In 2025, a mayoral candidate references Lucchese not as a villain, but as an example of organized strategy. She says, "What we need in this city isn't more drama, it's more Lucchese." She's criticized, naturally, but in the Bronx, she gets the vote, because the people there remember that the trains once ran on time, and not because the city scheduled them, but because someone made sure the envelopes moved first. The Mafia historians, now mostly academics and podcasters, have started calling Lucchese the architect, not because he designed buildings, but because he built behavioral architecture, frameworks, unshakable norms. He was the kind of man who'd ask, "Can we do it cleaner?" And not just mean literally. Cleaner as in smoother, cleaner as in repeatable. That's legacy. Not a name in lights, but a function that keeps functioning. One story, perhaps apocryphal, tells of a young restaurateur whose father once paid street tax to the Lucchese family. When the father died, the son expected the shakedowns to continue. But nothing came. No collectors, no calls. Only, once a year, a man in a pressed coat who dined alone, paid in cash, tipped 30%, and left quietly. That went on for 5 years, then stopped. No reason given, just completed. No blood, no fire, just closure. That too was Tommy's way. Even in the world of favor and fear, he believed in clean endings. Many people still think that Lucchese got lucky, that he simply operated in a less violent time. But look closer, and you'll find he outlived his peers not by chance, but by design. He curated his risks, delegated wisely, kept his own ego ironed down like his cuffs, and perhaps most radical of all, he didn't need to be adored. He just needed things to work. In the late nights, when city lights flicker, and only the sound of distant horns hums through empty streets, some men still check their watches, not because they're late, but because something in them remembers. Lucchese liked things on time, and if you're late, you're not part of the system. You're part of the problem. So the gears keep turning, the papers get passed, the jobs stay quiet. And Tommy? He keeps showing up where no one's looking, because that was always his brilliance. He made himself unnecessary, and in doing so, he made himself eternal. As the years slide further from the world Tommy Lucchese once inhabited, his influence becomes paradoxically stronger. Not louder, not larger, just more embedded, more taken for granted, like gravity, or the hum of refrigeration behind a deli counter. It's not that people remember Tommy, it's that they still follow his rules, often without knowing they're doing it. On a rainy Friday in Brooklyn, a freight driver arrives early to an old warehouse with an invoice dated 6 days in advance. He apologizes for the mix-up, but the foreman shrugs and points him toward the same loading bay as always. "We don't care what the paper says," the man tells him. "Truck's here early? Great, long as it's here." That's a Tommy policy. Punctuality over perfection. Arrival over excuses. The paperwork, always secondary. He used to say, if it's written, it can be questioned. If it's expected, it flows. And still it flows. In the outer boroughs, where the city's attention runs thin and predictability keeps small businesses alive, there's a quiet reverence for schedules that work. Not because of any saint's blessing, but because, for decades, someone made sure that someone made sure. That was Tommy's magic. He installed certainty in an uncertain world. while others ruled with spectacle and scandal. He ran his empire like a tailor keeps a shop. Door open at 8, fittings on the hour. No overpromising, no overcharging, and above all, no mess on the floor. And perhaps that's why people trusted him, more than they ever trusted the state or each other, because in a city that breaks its promises before breakfast, Lucchese delivered. Even his critics say it. He may have run a criminal enterprise, but he ran it better than most mayors ran their offices. One retired NYPD detective speaking on background to a journalist in 2026 put it bluntly. We knew when a problem came from Lucchese's side, it wasn't sloppy, it wasn't random. And if we got involved, we knew we were disrupting something more efficient than us. Let that sink in. The police, in some corners, quietly admitted that Tommy's world was cleaner than their own. That's how deep his systems went, not just into the mafia, but into the bones of the city. You know the little envelope slot in the back wall of that old Italian bakery on Roosevelt? Covered now with a sticker that says employees only, it used to collect the Sunday drop. Not money, not orders, just reports, numbers, tallies, summaries, typed by hand, single copy, one envelope, and no one ever missed a week, not once. That bakery changed ownership 4 times, but the slot is still there, sealed but honored, and every new owner is told, leave that wall alone, just tradition. That's Lucchese, uncredited, undefeated. You won't find his face carved on buildings, but you'll find his influence in the quiet perfection of things that still run without chaos. Many people still think Tommy was too quiet to be dangerous, but they mistake silence for softness. In reality, Lucchese was like pressure applied to a hinge, steady, necessary, and never loud. When you opened a door and it didn't squeak, that was him. When no one panicked, even when the sky looked like it might fall, that was his tempo. He didn't just build an empire, he built expectation. And once expectation becomes habit, it stops needing enforcement. That's the genius. There's a story, probably half true, about an old Lucchese underboss who retired to Florida. He ran a landscaping company under a different name. One day, a kid shows up late for work, dragging a weed trimmer behind him, headphones in, no apology. The old man doesn't yell. He just says, "We don't start late. That's not the system." The kid shrugs. The old man quietly lets him go by noon. When asked why, he simply says, "If you mess up the rhythm, I don't care how good your work is. You're playing a different song." That was Lucchese's standard. Not loyalty through fear, but membership through rhythm. You were in. Not if you could fight, but if you could match the pace. That's why he never needed speeches, why his empire never needed fireworks, and why, even now, there are unseen metronomes ticking behind the scenes of New York's oldest operations. Tommy's still here. He's in the early opened storefronts, in the envelopes sealed just right, in the shift changes that happen at 6:01 p.m. Never earlier, never later. You won't hear his name shouted in the streets, but if you sit still and really listen, you might feel it in the way this city still breathes in rhythm, a rhythm sewn into it by a man who once took measurements in chalk before ever picking up a knife. The strange thing about true influence is that it rarely announces itself. It doesn't knock on the door. It adjusts the hinges. That's how Tommy Lucchese built a legacy, not through declarations, but through design. And not the kind of design that needs blueprints, but the kind that reshapes behavior until everyone forgets where the habit started. Take, for instance, the payroll envelopes at a midtown garment factory, still running under a union, with suspiciously spotless books. No one talks about who organizes the routes. No one has ever seen the courier. But like clockwork, the paperwork is correct, the cash flows neatly, and the workers get paid 2 hours before any banking delay might risk a bounce. It's elegant, and if you ask the foreman why things work so well, he'll shrug and say, "It's just how we've always done it." But look deeper, and you'll see Lucchese's fingerprints again. Structural, not symbolic. His magic wasn't in being feared or revered. It was in being functional. Every empire before him sought control through threat. Tommy sought it through predictability. There's power in that. Quiet power. The kind that moves through generations, not like legend, but like routine. Even in law enforcement circles, the name still carries a kind of reluctant respect. A former assistant U.S. attorney who once led organized crime cases described Lucchese as the man who gave structure to chaos. Not because he was the smartest, not even the richest, but because he understood a basic truth. People don't crave freedom. They crave order. Tommy gave them that. He gave it to his crews, to his neighborhoods, to the supply chains that ran like silk across borough lines. He even gave it, unintentionally, to his enemies. Because it's hard to prosecute something that doesn't stumble. Hard to break something that bends before it snaps. By the mid-2020s, most young people in New York don't recognize the name. But they know the effects. They know certain restaurants always open early and never run out of bread. They know which waste removal routes somehow get picked up before the trucks are even expected. They know which warehouses are impossible to buy out, because no matter how good your offer, someone already pays on time. That's Tommy, still playing housekeeper in a city that no longer sees the broom. And what about his family? The Lucchese organization today bears only fragments of its founder's presence. The crews are leaner, the operations decentralized. Surveillance makes things messier, faster, harder to choreograph. But the bones remain. It's not the name, it's the discipline, the understanding that to survive, you don't need muscle, you need maintenance. And while other families wrestle with factions, infighting, and too many hungry mouths, the remnants of Lucchese's crew continue to be consistent. They don't draw attention. They don't fight over scraps. They don't flash. They function. And so, even now, a low-level earner with no memory of Tommy's voice still gets told, "You don't work for a gang. You work for the schedule." That's the old ghost again whispering. There's a well-circulated tale in underground circles about a city council bid in Brooklyn where one candidate received silent backing from several neighborhood unions. When asked how she earned their trust, she said she didn't. She just met every single one of them exactly on time. Every time, someone in her campaign staff muttered, "You must be channeling Lucchese." She didn't know the name, but she smiled anyway. Because the praise landed, even without the face. Many people still think Tommy got lucky, that his era was simpler, that he didn't face the fragmentation or tech-savvy chaos of modern organized crime. But luck doesn't last. What lasts is structure. Lucchese's legacy isn't preserved in marble or myth. It's alive in the unnoticed efficiency of things that should have collapsed, but didn't. It's in that phone call that arrives when it's supposed to. In that truck that never needs a GPS. In the man who never makes excuses, because Tommy wouldn't have accepted them. That's the funny part. You could erase his name from every record, burn the photos, scrub the databases, and still, he'd show up, not in face, but in form, because when you build something properly, you don't need to be there to run it. Tommy Lucchese figured that out long before the rest of the world tried to brand it leadership. He just called it doing things right. And so the story winds forward. Quiet, uncelebrated, etched not in bronze, but in the silent handshake of two men who both showed up exactly when they said they would. On time, as expected, just like Tommy taught them. The last breath of a legacy doesn't echo through headlines or monuments. It hums in the places we stop noticing. The coffee brewed exactly 5 minutes before the first customer arrives. The ledger closed with no errors for 3 fiscal quarters straight. The train that always seems to hit its mark with 1 second to spare. That's not coincidence. That's craftsmanship. And that, more than anything, is what Tommy Lucchese left behind. In a Bronx storage facility rarely visited by outsiders, a man in his 60s still unlocks the side entrance at 6:28 a.m. sharp. He doesn't remember who taught him that exact time, just that it mattered, that it meant something, that someone once said it lined up better with the bakery's morning drop. The bakery closed in '92, but the door still opens at 6:28 every day. Somewhere in the blue fog of pre-dawn, a teenager rides his moped to deliver packages across Queens. The company's small, faceless, and efficient. No one misses a drop. Each envelope goes out with a single rubber band and a precise fold. He doesn't know who started that style, only that the boss likes it neat. He doesn't know the boss is quoting a ghost. In downtown Manhattan, across from the steel and glass of a city addicted to urgency, sits a dry cleaning shop run by a man named Carlo. On the wall, behind faded family photos and an old map of Sicily, hangs a plaque that says simply, "Do it once, do it right, do it quiet." Lucchese didn't write that line, but you can hear him in it, can't you? Tommy Lucchese never needed slogans. He needed standards. He didn't die trying to rule the world. He died making sure his part of it ran on time, with minimal blood and maximum consistency. And that may be why his name endures, not as a martyr or a monster, but as a method. Many people still think mafia stories need fireworks to be worth telling. They want blood, betrayal, chaos. They forget that the most dangerous man in the room isn't always the one with a gun. It's the one who never raises his voice, never fumbles a number, never shows up unprepared. That was Tommy, the quiet Don, the tailor of order, the man who ironed out wrinkles in systems the same way others ironed suits. Even now, a well-oiled machine somewhere in the city is running on rails he laid. Even now, young men are promoted, not because they shouted loudest, but because they didn't cause trouble. Even now, invisible threads pull at levers in council rooms, loading docks, union halls, and if you trace those threads, you won't find explosions. You'll find a desk, a drawer full of notes, a routine, and at the heart of it, the memory of a man who proved that efficiency could be a throne, that you didn't need to rule with fear if you could lead with reliability. He didn't build a family. He built a framework, not a kingdom, a clock. And that's the reason we still whisper his name. Not in awe, but in rhythm. Because in a world that forgets everything, we always remember what works. And Tommy Lucchese, he worked. Like a quiet beat, like a trusted shadow, like something you don't notice until it's gone. So now, as the hum of the city drifts behind us, and the image of that quiet tailor fades into the soft folds of memory, let your thoughts settle. Let them ease into the cadence of stillness, the kind Lucchese would have preferred. No alarms, no chaos, just things in their place. Imagine the steady rhythm of old delivery vans, their engines purring like lullabies across wet asphalt. The smell of early bread, the shuffle of polished shoes, and the quiet nod between two men who understand the unspoken value of showing up on time. This is the world Tommy built. Not flashy, not loud, but reliable, like the click of a lock well turned. Breathe deeply now, slow and even. The chaos can wait. You're walking dim streets where nothing startles, only flows. Where every echo is accounted for. Where history wears a pressed collar and polished shoes, and where the most dangerous man in the room simply listens, and listens well. Let your body loosen, like a jacket slipping off after a long day. Let your eyes grow heavier, not with fear, but with understanding. That the world, for all its noise, still spins better when someone like Tommy quietly keeps the gears turning. Good night, friend. Sleep deep and let the rhythm carry you.